Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. October had always been my month of solitude. For the past 7 years, I'd carved out this time from my demanding job as a financial analyst to decompress and wrestle my anxiety back into submission. The ritual was sacred. No emails, no conference calls, just me and whatever activities could quiet the constant static in my mind. This particular October started like all the others. I'd already demolished 2 large pepperoni pizzas while marathoning classic horror films in my apartment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Seeking comfort in fictional terror while trying to escape real-world stress. But there was something therapeutic about controlled fear, about knowing the credits would roll and the monsters would disappear. The hiking component of my annual retreat had become the centerpiece over the years. There was something about the autumn transformation that spoke to me, watching nature shed its skin, preparing for dormancy before eventual rebirth. I'd worn paths into the local trails around Millstone County, knew every route and rock formation by heart. That's why when Brandon, a fellow hiker I'd met at the outdoor equipment store, mentioned an unmarked trail about 45 minutes north, my interest was immediately piqued. We'd been comparing notes on local hikes while I shopped for new trail markers, and his eyes had lit up when describing this particular path. "It's not official," Brandon had explained, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "No Park Service maintenance. No blazes on the trees, but people definitely use it. You can see the wear patterns in the earth, the broken branches at consistent heights where hands have pushed through." He'd drawn me a crude map on the back of my receipt, marking specific mile markers along Route 47 where I'd find the entrance. "Bring your own markers," he'd insisted. "I left some when I went, but you never know what condition they'll be in. And tell someone where you're going. Cell service gets spotty out there." The morning of my hike dawned crisp and clear. I'd called my parents the night before, enduring their usual worried questions about hiking alone. My ex-girlfriend Carla had texted too, checking in despite our recent breakup. Old habits, I supposed. I gave them all the same information: approximate location, expected return time, instructions to call park services if they didn't hear from me by evening. The drive north was peaceful, my car winding through increasingly rural landscapes as suburban sprawl gave way to farmland and forest. I found Brandon's landmarks easily enough: the abandoned gas station at mile marker 31, the faded billboard for a long-closed attraction at marker 34. At marker 36.5 I slowed, scanning the tree line for the gap he'd described. There it was, barely visible from the road, just a slight depression between 2 massive oak trees. No parking area, of course. I pulled onto the shoulder, wheels crunching on gravel and dead leaves. The silence when I cut the engine was immediate and complete, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. I took my time preparing. Hiking boots double knotted, backpack loaded with water, protein bars, first aid kit, whistle, and fully charged phone. The trail markers I'd bought were bright orange flags on wire stakes, each decorated with small crosses, a design choice that now seems oddly prescient. The entrance to the trail was more obvious once I approached on foot. The earth was indeed worn down, creating a natural pathway about 3 feet wide. Overhead, branches had been broken or pushed aside at regular intervals, creating an informal tunnel through the dense undergrowth. Many someones had definitely been this way before. I planted my first marker right at the entrance, pushing the stake deep into the soft earth. The little orange flag stood out brilliantly against the brown and gold backdrop of autumn leaves. Satisfied, I took my first steps onto the unmarked trail. The first hour passed in a meditation of movement and observation. Every 100 yards or so, I'd stop to place another marker, always near some distinguishing feature: a fallen log, a distinctive rock formation, a tree with unusual bark patterns. I noticed other markers too: weather-beaten ribbons tied to branches, small cairns of stacked stones, even what looked like initials carved into tree trunks, evidence of other adventurous souls who'd found this hidden path. The forest here was different from my usual trails. Older, somehow. The trees were massive, their canopy so dense that only scattered rays of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The undergrowth was sparse, choked out by the lack of light, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. My footsteps were muffled by decades of decomposing leaves. I found myself thinking about work, about the promotion I'd been passed over for, about Carla's reasons for leaving. The natural beauty around me was supposed to be washing these concerns away, but instead they seemed to grow heavier with each step. Maybe that's why I didn't immediately notice how far I'd traveled, or how the character of the forest had begun to change. The trees were even closer together now, their trunks pressing in on the trail from both sides. The path itself had narrowed, forcing me to turn sideways in places to squeeze through. My marker supply was running lower than expected. Had I really come this far already? I decided to rest on a moss-covered log, pulling out my water bottle and taking careful sips. The forest was alive with small sounds, chittering squirrels, distant woodpeckers, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. I checked my phone 2:47 p.m. Still plenty of daylight left, but I'd need to turn back soon. That's when it happened. Between one heartbeat and the next, every sound ceased. Not gradually, not naturally, but all at once, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. The silence was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I cleared my throat loudly, needing to confirm I hadn't suddenly lost my hearing. The sound seemed to shatter whatever spell had fallen over the forest. Immediately the ambient noise resumed, birds singing, leaves rustling, insects buzzing. But something had changed. The quality of the sounds was different now, like a recording played back at slightly the wrong speed. I stood quickly, suddenly eager to begin my return journey. The water bottle went back in my pack with shaking hands. I told myself it was just dehydration, just my imagination running wild after too many horror movies. But my body knew better. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave. The first few return markers appeared exactly where I'd left them. The orange flags were reassuring beacons guiding me home. I pulled each one up as I passed, not wanting to leave trash in this pristine wilderness. But after collecting maybe 6 or 7, I stopped at a marker that made no sense. This flag was attached to a tree trunk about 5 feet off the ground. I stood staring at it, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with my memory. I hadn't placed any markers on trees. I'd been very careful to put them all in the ground where they'd be clearly visible. Yet here was one of my distinctive orange flags with the cross symbol, wrapped around a birch trunk. I reached up to remove it, and that's when I noticed the next marker. This one was placed dead center in the trail, the stake driven so deep that only the flag portion was visible above ground. Again, not something I would have done. I always placed markers to the side of the trail near landmarks. My heartbeat accelerated. Someone had moved my markers. But why? And when? I hadn't seen another soul on the trail, hadn't heard anyone following me. The forest had been mine alone, or so I'd thought. I started walking faster, no longer bothering to collect the markers. They appeared with increasing frequency now, sometimes 3 or 4 visible at once. Some were in impossible places, wedged between rocks, hanging from branches, arranged in small circles just off the trail. The crosses on each flag seemed to mock me, religious symbols turned sinister by their inexplicable relocation. Panic was creeping in around the edges of my consciousness. I pulled out my phone, opening the app connected to my car's system. I pressed the alarm button, straining to hear any response. Nothing. The forest swallowed the signal. Or perhaps I was simply too far away. The trail was wrong now, too. I didn't remember this steep incline, these exposed roots that caught at my boots. The trees were different. Younger, more uniform, planted in suspiciously straight lines. This wasn't the path I'd taken in, but the markers continued to appear, leading me forward with malevolent insistence. 50 minutes of increasingly frantic hiking brought me to a cluster of markers that stopped me cold. 3 flags, planted in a perfect triangle around what I initially took for a boulder. The massive shape was covered in moss and creeping vines, naturally camouflaged against the forest floor. But boulders don't have corners. Boulders don't have rusted metal fixtures protruding from their surfaces. As my eyes adjusted to what I was really seeing, the shape resolved itself into something far more disturbing. A small structure, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, so overgrown with vegetation that it had become part of the landscape. It was clearly old, abandoned for decades at least. The wood visible beneath the plant growth was gray and weathered, soft with rot. What might have once been a window was now just a dark gap in one wall, and the door, the door hung askew on failing hinges, revealing nothing but blackness within. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen this decomposing structure in the middle of nowhere. But my feet seemed rooted to the earth, my eyes unable to look away from that dark doorway. Who builds a shed this far from civilization? What purpose could it have served? The crack was explosive in the forest. Quiet wood protesting against wood as the door swung wider. The squeal of rusty hinges followed, a sound that raised every hair on my body. And then from that impenetrable darkness within the structure, a pale hand emerged. Not quickly, not threateningly, but with deliberate slowness. Just a hand at first, elderly and weathered, with prominent veins and age spots visible even from 20 feet away. Then the forearm, clothed in what might have been flannel, faded to colorlessness. The hand paused at the door frame, and one finger, the index finger, began to move. It curled inward slowly, then extended. Curled and extended. The universal gesture for "come here," executed with mechanical precision. No other part of the arm moved. No face appeared in the doorway. Just that pale hand and its hypnotic beckoning. My paralysis shattered. I spun around so fast I nearly fell, then launched myself back down the trail at a dead sprint. Branches whipped at my face. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't slow down. The image of that beckoning finger was burned into my retinas, appearing every time I blinked. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled. Finally, when I physically couldn't continue, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone again, desperate to try the car alarm. I pressed the button repeatedly, like a prayer. There, faint but unmistakable, my car's horn echoed through the forest. I oriented myself toward the sound and started moving again. Not running now, but walking as fast as my exhausted body would allow. Each time the alarm cycle ended, I'd press the button again, following the sound like a lifeline. The trees began to thin. The undergrowth returned. And then, blessedly, I could see glimpses of road through the vegetation. My car sat exactly where I'd left it. Afternoon sun glinting off its windows like a beacon of civilization. I've never been so happy to see that beat-up sedan in my life. I fumbled with my keys, hands still shaking, and practically fell into the driver's seat. The doors locked with a satisfying thunk. Only then, surrounded by steel and glass, did I allow myself to look back at the forest entrance. It appeared exactly as it had hours ago. Just a gap in the trees, utterly unremarkable. No sign of pursuit. No pale hands reaching from the shadows. I started the engine and pulled onto the road so fast my tires squealed. I drove without thinking, taking turns at random, needing only to put distance between myself and that unmarked trail. It wasn't until I saw signs for the interstate that I began to calm down enough to think clearly. The first rest stop I came to became my temporary sanctuary. I parked under the brightest light I could find, despite it still being daylight, and sat there trying to process what had happened. My rational mind offered explanations, hallucinations brought on by dehydration, a local hermit playing pranks on hikers, my imagination running wild after too much stress and too little sleep. But I knew what I'd seen. That hand hadn't been a hallucination. The repositioned markers hadn't been my imagination. Something had been deeply wrong on that trail, and I'd been lucky to escape it. That was 3 years ago. I still take my October retreats, still order pizza and watch horror movies. But my hiking habits have changed dramatically. I stick to well-marked popular trails now, preferably ones with plenty of other hikers around. I've never gone back to that area off Route 47, never tried to find that unmarked trail again. I did some research afterward, spent hours scouring online forums and local historical archives. I found nothing about the trail specifically, but I did discover that the area had a history. In the 1960s, several hikers had gone missing in those woods. Search parties found no trace of them. In the 1980s, a geological survey team reported finding anomalous structures deep in the forest but provided no details. Sometimes I wonder about that shed, about who or what was inside it. Was it some hermit, driven mad by isolation? A homeless person who'd created their own twisted welcome for rare visitors? Or something else, something that defied rational explanation. I never told Brandon about my experience when I ran into him at the outdoor store months later. He asked how the hike had gone, and I simply said I'd decided to stick to marked trails from now on. He'd seemed disappointed but didn't press. I wonder sometimes if he knew more than he'd let on, if sending me to that trail had been some kind of test or trap. The markers I left behind still haunt me. Are they still there, relocated again and again to lead other unsuspecting hikers to that moldering structure? Did I inadvertently become part of the trap myself, providing fresh bait for whatever lurks in those woods? I've thought about reporting the incident to the authorities, but what would I say? That I saw a creepy shed and someone waved at me. They'd dismiss it as the overreaction of a stressed-out city person. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe that's what I need to believe. But on quiet nights, when October rolls around again and the leaves begin to change, I can still see that pale finger beckoning in my mind's eye. I can still feel the wrongness of that silent forest, the malevolence hidden beneath its natural beauty, and I know with a certainty that goes beyond rational thought that I made the right choice in running. Some trails are unmarked for a reason. Some places are meant to be lost, and some invitations should never ever be accepted. I live in northern Utah on the edge of a small highway town, about 20 minutes north of Brigham City. My house sits alone on 40 acres of scrubland and sparse woodland, connected to civilization by a winding dirt road that branches off State Route 8. The main highway cuts through what passes for our downtown, a cluster of weathered buildings that includes 2 truck stops, a Family Dollar, a struggling grocery store called Miller's Market, and 3 motels that charge by the hour or the week. Most people just blow through on their way to Idaho or down to Salt Lake City. Nobody really stops here unless they have to. It was a Tuesday in late October 2018, and I'd been working from home for about 6 months at that point. I was 27 years old, doing remote IT support for a company based in Denver. The isolation had started to wear on me, if I'm being honest. Days would pass where I wouldn't speak to another human being face to face. Just me, my computer screen, and the endless view of brown grass and scrub oak outside my windows. That particular evening, I wrapped up work around 6 o'clock. The sun was already sinking toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. I'd been putting off a grocery run for 3 days, living on canned soup and stale crackers, so I grabbed my keys and headed into town. The drive took about 15 minutes on the dirt road before I hit pavement. The highway was quiet, as usual for a weekday evening. Maybe 5 or 6 cars passed me going the opposite direction. Miller's Market occupied a squat concrete building with a faded red awning and a parking lot full of potholes. I pulled in around 6:30, parking toward the back like I always did. Old habit from my dad. He always said parking far away from other cars meant fewer chances of door dings. Even in an empty lot, I still did it. The automatic doors wheezed open as I walked inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sickly bluish-white glow that grocery stores seem to prefer. I grabbed a cart with a wobbly wheel and started down the produce aisle. There were maybe 10 other customers in the whole store, spread out across the different sections. I was picking through some tired-looking apples when I felt it, that prickly sensation on the back of your neck when someone's staring at you. I glanced up and saw him for the first time. He was standing at the far end of the produce section, near the bagged salads. Tall guy, maybe 6'1" or 6'2", wearing a dark blue jacket and jeans. He had a gaunt face, the kind where the cheekbones jut out sharp and the eyes sit a little too deep in the skull. Our eyes met for just a second before I looked back down at the apples. Probably nothing, I told myself. People look at other people in grocery stores. It doesn't mean anything. I put a few apples in a plastic bag and moved on to the canned goods aisle. I needed tomato sauce, chicken broth, some beans. I was scanning the shelves when I felt it again, that watched feeling. I looked to my left and there he was. He'd followed me to the same aisle, standing maybe 5 feet away. Close enough that it felt wrong, especially in an otherwise empty aisle. He wasn't looking at the shelves. He was looking directly at me. My hand froze on a can of black beans. I tried to play it casual, tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but something in my gut was screaming at me that this wasn't normal. The man wasn't pushing a cart. He wasn't holding a basket. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides. "Hi," I said, forcing my voice to sound friendly and normal. Maybe if I acknowledged him, he'd realize he was being weird and back off. He didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't move. He just kept staring at me with those deep-set eyes. His expression was completely blank, like looking at a mannequin. I grabbed the can of beans quickly and pushed my cart forward, moving faster now. My heart was starting to beat harder in my chest. I went to the next aisle, pasta and rice, and grabbed a box of spaghetti without really looking at it. When I glanced back toward the end cap, I saw him turn the corner into my aisle again. This time I didn't stop. I abandoned the aisle and headed straight for the dairy section in the back. I grabbed milk and cheese without paying attention to prices or brands, just wanting to finish and get out. But when I looked up from the refrigerated case, I saw him again. He was standing at the end of the aisle, partially hidden behind a display of crackers, but I could see his face, still watching me, still not shopping for anything. My hands were actually shaking now as I pushed my cart toward the checkout. There were 2 lanes open. I picked the one with the shorter line, just one person ahead of me, an elderly woman buying cat food and bread. I kept my back to the store, trying not to look, trying not to confirm what I already knew, that he was still out there, still watching. The cashier was a teenager with acne and headphones around his neck. He scanned my items with the practiced indifference of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. I paid in cash, not wanting to wait for the card reader. The receipt printed out, and I grabbed my bags. "Have a good night," the cashier mumbled. I didn't respond. I was already pushing through the door, bags clutched in both arms. The parking lot was darker now, the last traces of daylight gone. The overhead lights created small pools of sickly yellow illumination surrounded by deep shadows. My car sat out at the edge of one of these pools, the silver paint looking gray in the artificial light. I walked quickly, keys already in my hand. When I reached my car, I popped the trunk and threw the bags in without organizing them. Then I got in the driver's seat, locked the doors immediately, and sat there for a moment, breathing hard. I felt ridiculous. Maybe the guy was just socially awkward. Maybe he had some kind of developmental issue and didn't realize he was being creepy. Maybe I was overreacting. I looked up at the store entrance, and my breath caught in my throat. He was there, standing in the parking lot between 2 cars, about 40 feet away. He wasn't walking to a vehicle, he was just standing there, facing my direction. The overhead light illuminated half his face, leaving the other half in shadow. He didn't have any grocery bags. He hadn't bought anything. I started my car and backed out fast, tires squealing slightly on the asphalt. I pulled out onto the highway and headed north, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see any headlights following me, but my heart was still racing. The highway was empty. No traffic in either direction, just me and the broken white lines disappearing under my hood. After about 5 miles, I turned off onto the dirt road that led to my property. The road twisted through empty scrubland. No houses, no lights, nothing but darkness pressing in from all sides. My headlights carved a tunnel through the night, illuminating the dust that my tires kicked up. Usually this drive felt peaceful, a transition from the noise of civilization to the quiet of home. Tonight it felt exposed and vulnerable. When I reached my house, I parked in front and grabbed 2 bags from the trunk. My porch light was on, casting a warm yellow glow across the wooden steps. Everything looked normal, safe. I went inside and put the first load of groceries on the kitchen counter. I was putting a gallon of milk in the refrigerator when my phone rang. It was my dad. He lived down in Ogden, and called me a couple times a week, usually to see how I was doing and to complain about his neighbors. We talked for about 15 minutes. He told me about a leak in his basement, asked if I'd heard from my sister lately, mentioned that my uncle had surgery on his knee. Normal stuff. The conversation calmed me down, made the weirdness at the store feel less immediate. After we hung up, I realized I'd left the rest of the groceries in the car. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold, probably dropping down into the low 40s. I could see my breath in the porch light. I started walking toward my car, keys jangling in my hand. That's when I saw it. Out past my property's edge, maybe 300 yards away and slightly off the dirt road, there was a vehicle. A truck, from the shape of it. Dark colored, maybe black or dark blue. All the lights were off. No headlights, No taillights, no interior lights, just a dark shape sitting on my land in the middle of nothing. I stopped walking, stood there in the cold, staring out at that truck. It definitely hadn't been there when I drove in. I would have noticed. The dirt road came straight down past my house. If someone had driven in after me, I would have heard them, would have seen their headlights sweep across my windows. But I'd been on the phone with my dad. Could they have driven up with their lights off? Was that even possible on that road without crashing? I approached my car slowly, never taking my eyes off that distant truck. I opened the trunk and grabbed the remaining grocery bags, then backed toward my house watching. The truck didn't move. No doors opened. No lights came on. It just sat there, a dark mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the night sky. Inside, I locked the door behind me and put the groceries away with shaking hands. My mind was racing, trying to find innocent explanations. Maybe it was someone who'd pulled off the highway to sleep, like I'd thought before. Truck drivers did that sometimes. Found empty spaces to park for the night instead of paying for a motel room. It was private property, sure. But maybe they didn't realize that. Maybe they thought it was just open land. Or maybe it was him. That thought sent a spike of ice through my stomach. But no, that didn't make sense. How would he have known where I lived? I'd never seen him before today. He couldn't have followed me without me noticing the highway was too empty, the dirt road too long. Unless he'd followed me before. Unless today at the store wasn't the first time he'd seen me. I went to the front window and carefully pulled back the curtain. From this angle, I could just barely see the truck, a dark shape in the darkness. I stood there for a long time, watching. It didn't move. After about 20 minutes, my rational mind started to win out over my fear. Whoever was out there, they weren't coming to the house. They were just parked, sleeping probably. I let the curtain fall closed and tried to go about my evening. I made dinner pasta with the sauce I'd bought, though I barely tasted it. I did the dishes. I sat down in the living room and turned on the TV, found some crime documentary that I'd been meaning to watch, but every few minutes I'd get up and check the window. The truck was always there, always dark, never moving. Around 9:30, I opened the curtain more fully and just left it that way. If someone was going to be parked on my property, I wanted to see if they tried to approach the house. I settled onto the couch with a better view of the window and tried to focus on the TV show. It was about a serial killer in Florida in the 1990s, a man who'd killed 6 women before finally being caught. Under normal circumstances, I found these shows fascinating. Tonight, it just made me more anxious. By 11 o'clock, the truck still hadn't moved. I was starting to feel foolish for being so scared. It was just someone sleeping. In the morning, they'd wake up and drive away, probably embarrassed that they'd parked on private property. I'd probably never see them again. I turned off the TV and went upstairs. My bedroom was at the front of the house, with windows that looked out over the same view as the living room. I pulled back the curtain and looked out one more time. The truck was still there. I closed the curtain, brushed my teeth, and got into bed. I fell asleep faster than I expected. Something woke me. I opened my eyes to complete darkness, disoriented and foggy. I had to use the bathroom. That's what had pulled me out of sleep. I sat up and grabbed my phone from the nightstand to check the time. 2:47 a.m. The house was silent. I got out of bed and padded across the bedroom floor in my bare feet, wearing just boxer shorts and a t-shirt. The hardwood was cold. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, turning left toward the bathroom. That's when I heard it. A creak from downstairs. Not the settling creak of an old house. I'd lived here long enough to know those sounds. This was different. This was the creak of weight on a floorboard. The creak of someone taking a step. I froze in the hallway, my hand still on the bathroom doorknob. I held my breath and listened. For several seconds there was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was still half asleep and paranoid from earlier. Then I heard it again. Another creak, slightly different in pitch. A second step. My heart started hammering. I released the doorknob carefully, trying not to make any sound. I walked to the end of the hallway where it opened up to look down the stairs. The downstairs was dark except for a faint gray light coming from the kitchen windows, moonlight filtering through the curtains. I stood at the top of the stairs and stared down into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. just the familiar shapes of my furniture rendered strange and angular by the darkness. But then I noticed the shadow on the wall of the downstairs hallway, which ran perpendicular to the stairs. There was a shadow that didn't match anything. It was the silhouette of a person, head, shoulders, torso, and it was moving. Just slightly, shifting weight, breathing. Someone was in my house. I backed away from the stairs as slowly and quietly as I could. My mind was screaming at me to run, to move faster, but I forced myself to stay controlled. Any sudden noise might let them know I was awake. I made it back to my bedroom door and slipped inside, then closed it with agonizing slowness. The latch clicked softly. I turned the lock, which made a slightly louder click, and I winced. Then I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, professional. Someone's in my house, I whispered, my voice shaking. I heard them downstairs. I saw their shadow. They broke in. What's your address? I gave it to her, along with directions off Route 89. Turn at the Miller's Market. Follow the dirt road for 3 miles. Are you in a safe location right now? I'm in my bedroom upstairs. I locked the door. Okay, stay there. Don't try to confront them. Officers are on their way. Stay on the line with me. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, straining to hear any sounds from downstairs. For several minutes there was nothing. The silence was almost worse than the creaking. It meant they'd stopped moving, which meant they were staying still, listening, maybe trying to figure out where I was. Then I heard it, more creaking. Multiple steps in quick succession. Footsteps crossing from the hallway into what sounded like the living room. The floorboards there were older, louder. I could track their movement by sound. They walked slowly through the living room, paused, then continued. They're moving around downstairs, I whispered to the operator. Stay where you are. Officers are about 8 minutes away. 8 minutes felt like a lifetime. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, every muscle tensed, barely breathing. The operator stayed on the line, occasionally asking if I was okay, telling me the officers were getting closer. I gave her descriptions of my house layout, told her about the truck parked in the field, explained that I thought someone had followed me from the grocery store. Minutes crawled by. I heard more footsteps, creaking in different parts of the house. At one point I thought I heard the sound of a drawer opening in the kitchen. Were they looking for something? Weapons? Money? Or were they looking for where I was? Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. No more footsteps, no more creaking, just silence. It was somehow even more terrifying than the sounds had been. They stopped moving, I whispered to the operator. I don't hear them anymore. Officers are about 3 minutes away, she said. Stay quiet and stay put. Those 3 minutes stretched into an eternity. I stared at my bedroom door, half expecting it to burst open. I thought about my options if that happened. I had no weapons up here. There was a window, but it was a 15-foot drop to the ground, and I'd probably break an ankle or worse. I'd basically be trapped. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the stairs. They were slow, deliberate. Step, pause, step, pause. Someone climbing the stairs, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. The old wood betrayed each footfall. They're coming upstairs, I said, my voice barely audible. Officers are pulling up now, the operator said urgently. Stay where you are. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. There was a pause. Then I heard them moving down the hallway toward my room. Then, miraculously, I heard a new sound, the wail of a siren in the distance, getting louder fast. The footsteps in the hallway immediately broke into a run. I heard them pounding back down the stairs, heard the back door bang open. They're running, I said to the operator. I heard the back door. Stay in your room until officers knock, she instructed. I heard a vehicle start up outside, the truck in the field. I ran to my window and pulled back the curtain. Red and blue lights were strobing up my dirt road. 2 police vehicles approaching fast. In the field, I could see the truck's taillights come on as it began to move, bouncing over the rough terrain. The police cars skidded to a stop in front of my house, and officers jumped out. I watched as one car peeled off and tore across my field after the truck. The truck was trying to make it back to the dirt road, but it couldn't move fast over the bumpy ground. The police car had better suspension and closed the distance quickly. There was a knock on my front door. Police. I ran downstairs and fumbled with the lock, throwing the door open. 2 officers stood on my porch, hands near their weapons. "He ran out the back," I said, pointing. "He's in the truck out there. Your guys are chasing him." "Anyone else in the house?" one officer asked. "I don't think so. Just him." One officer went through my house room by room, while the other stayed with me. We stood on the front porch, watching the scene in the field. The truck had stopped, surrounded now by both police vehicles. I could see someone being pulled out of the driver's side door. 20 minutes later, the man was in handcuffs in the back of a police cruiser, and I was sitting at my kitchen table giving my statement to a deputy sheriff named Paulson. He was maybe 50 years old with gray hair and the kind of weathered face you get from spending too much time in the sun. "Can you describe what happened at the grocery store?" he asked, pen poised over a notebook. I told him everything, the way the man had stared at me, followed me through the aisles, appeared in the parking lot without any groceries. I described his appearance: tall, thin, gaunt face, dark blue jacket. "Can you come outside and see if you can identify him?" Paulson asked. My stomach twisted, but I nodded. We walked out to the police cruiser where the man sat in the back seat. One of the other officers opened the door so I could see him clearly in the dome light. It was him, the man from the store. Same gaunt face, same hollow eyes. He looked at me when I approached, and there was no emotion in his expression at all. No anger, no fear, no shame, just blank. "That's him," I said, backing away. "That's definitely him." Back inside, Paulson asked me more questions. Had I ever seen this man before today? Had I had any unusual encounters recently? Anyone following me or watching my house? Had I noticed any strange vehicles in the area? I answered no to everything. This man was a complete stranger to me. "We found a weapon in his vehicle," Paulson said, his voice serious. "A knife with an 8-inch blade. He also had rope and duct tape." My hands started shaking again. What was he going to do?" "He claims he was just planning to rob you," Paulson said. "But the evidence suggests something more than that. He didn't have a bag to carry stolen items. He didn't take anything from your house, even though he had plenty of time before we arrived. And you said he was watching you specifically at the store, not just casing random people. Do you think he was—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "We'll know more after we question him and run his information," Paulson said. "But I'll be honest with you, this doesn't look like a robbery attempt. This looks like someone who was planning to hurt you." The police didn't leave until almost 5 in the morning. They took photographs of my house, dusted for fingerprints, documented the damage to my back door where he'd forced the lock. They found evidence that he'd been standing outside my windows, watching me earlier in the evening. Boot prints in the dirt, cigarette butts. After they left, I sat in my living room as the sun came up, too wired to sleep. I kept thinking about the shadow on the wall, the footsteps coming up the stairs toward my room. What would have happened if the police had been even 2 minutes slower? Later that day, Paulson called to give me an update. The man's name was Gerald Tripp, age 41, and he had a record: 2 previous arrests for stalking, one in Oregon and one in Nevada. He'd served 18 months in prison and been released 14 months ago. They still didn't know why he'd targeted me specifically, but they were building a case that went beyond simple breaking and entering. The district attorney is looking at charges including stalking, burglary, possession of burglary tools, and possibly attempted kidnapping, Paulson told me. We're also checking to see if he might be connected to any other cases. "Other cases?" I asked. "There have been a few unsolved incidents in the area over the past year," he said carefully. "Women living alone, rural properties, break-ins where nothing was taken. We're looking into whether he might be connected." That thought made me feel sick. How many times had he done this? How many other women had he watched, followed, targeted? I installed a security system 2 days later. Motion sensor lights around the whole house, cameras at every entrance, glass break sensors on all the windows. I got a dog too, a German Shepherd mix from the shelter who'd been trained as a guard dog before his previous owner died. I named him Bear. The nightmares started about a week later. I'd wake up convinced I heard footsteps, convinced someone was in the house. It took months before I could sleep through the night again. Even now, years later, I'm more careful than most people have to be. I don't park in dark corners of parking lots anymore. I watch my mirrors obsessively when I'm driving. I notice when people look at me for too long. Gerald Tripp pleaded guilty to multiple charges and is currently serving a 15-year sentence. During the investigation, they found photographs of me on his phone, pictures taken through my windows, pictures of me at the grocery store on previous trips, pictures of my car. He'd been watching me for at least 2 weeks before he finally broke in that night. The police never could figure out what he was planning to do. He wouldn't say, but given what they found in his truck and his history, I think I know. And I'm grateful every single day that I woke up when I did, that I heard that creak on the stairs. Because if I hadn't, if I'd slept through, if the police had been slower, if anything had gone differently, I don't think I'd be here to tell this story. Some nights I still think about that shadow on the wall, moving slightly, breathing. I think about him climbing my stairs in the darkness. I think about how close it was. And I remember, evil doesn't always announce itself with thunder and drama. Sometimes it's just a stranger in a grocery store who looks at you a little too long. Sometimes it's just a truck with its lights off sitting in a field. Sometimes it's nothing at all until suddenly, in the middle of the night, you wake up and realize you're not alone. And by then, it's almost too late. And then I saw it, lying smack in the middle of the trail like someone had dropped it from the sky. A backpack. And a fancy one at that, all high-tech nylon and shiny buckles. It looked brand spanking new. I figured some city slicker had overestimated their wilderness skills and dumped their gear to lighten their load. Cautiously, I poked the pack with the toe of my boot. No response. I unzipped a pocket and found a wallet inside, driver's license, credit cards, the works. The name on the ID read, Stanley Burdock. Poor bastard probably wouldn't make it far without his supplies. The 11th of June, 1955. There I was, trekking through the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. Some folks head to the beach for vacation, but not me. I always head for the hills, a sucker for a good trail. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the smell of pine needles sharp in my nose, nothing beats it. This time, though, the trail took a turn I wasn't expecting. A turn that still makes my gut clench when I think about it, even all these years later. It was day 3 of my solo hike. The sun was beating down like a hammer on an anvil, and I was sweating like a sinner in church, but the scenery made it all worthwhile. Towering ponderosa pines stretched into the clear blue sky. The occasional flash of a blue jay caught my eye, and the distant rumble of a waterfall provided a soothing soundtrack. It was just me, Mother Nature, and a granola bar that tasted like cardboard. Life was good. With a sigh, I slung the heavy pack over my shoulder, adding a good 10 pounds to my load. But hey, good karma, right? I'd drop it off at the ranger station when I got back to civilization. No skin off my back. Oh, how naive I was. A couple hours later, I came across something else unexpected. A campsite tucked away under a cluster of Douglas firs. The tent was ripped to shreds, the sleeping bag torn open like a gutted fish. And there, lying next to the cold remnants of a campfire, was Stanley Burdock. Or what was left of him anyway. I'd never seen anything like it. Half his face was just gone, like something had taken a massive bite out of a ripe watermelon. His clothes were in tatters, limbs twisted at sickening, unnatural angles. The stench of decay hung heavy in the air. I didn't stick around to examine the gory details. I just turned, threw up the meager contents of my stomach, and hightailed it out of there as fast as my trembling legs could carry me. I ran until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed for mercy. Finally collapsing by a gurgling stream, I gasped for breath, my heart threatening to hammer right out of my heaving chest. What the hell had happened to that poor guy? A bear attack? A mountain lion? Or something far worse that my mind shied away from contemplating? I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Burdock's mangled face, that garish wound gaping like a second screaming mouth. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me jumping like a scared rabbit, clutching my hunting knife with white knuckles. I've never been so glad to see the sun rise. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, I was an exhausted, jittery wreck. I decided then and there to cut my trip short and hike back to the ranger station as quickly as my weary legs could manage. The return trek felt twice as long as the hike in. Every shifting shadow morphed into a hulking, bloodthirsty beast. Every whisper of wind carried the echo of an agonized scream. My imagination ran wild with dark possibilities. Just something moving in the bushes. I lied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. In truth, I thought I had glimpsed a flash of matted fur, the curve of a wicked claw. But I didn't want to sound like some raving lunatic spouting tall tales of monsters lurking in the woods. I was rattled enough as it was. When the rustic ranger station finally came into view, I could have wept with relief. I practically kissed the sun-baked earth. So glad was I to return to some shred of civilization and sanity. The ranger on duty, a grizzled old-timer by the name of Bill, listened to my frantic tale with a stony expression that could have been carved from the faces of the surrounding cliffs. "We've had reports of missing hikers," he said, his voice gravelly from years of barking orders and breathing campfire smoke. "Search parties haven't found a goddamned thing." He took Burdock's wallet from my shaking hands, fixing me with a piercing stare. "You sure you didn't see anything else out there, son? Hear anything unusual?" Ranger Bill just nodded slowly, his weathered face unreadable. "You best stay put. I've radioed the sheriff. She'll be wanting a word with you." The sheriff, as it turned out, was a young woman by the name of Deputy Ramona Garza. Sharp eyes, sharper mind, and a tongue that could cut glass. She grilled me for the better part of an hour, her pen scratching across a battered notepad as I recounted my story for the umpteenth time. When I got to the part about the shredded campsite and Burdock's mutilated body, I thought I saw a flicker of something, fear perhaps, dart across her chiseled features, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a mask of cool professionalism. "We'll take it from here," she said briskly, snapping her notebook shut with an air of finality. "The body will be retrieved and examined. In the meantime, I suggest you head on home, mister, and maybe stick to city parks and greenways for a while." "Yeah? The wilderness isn't always as idyllic as it seems." I wanted to protest, to tell her about the icy dread that still lurked in my gut, the certainty that something out there was watching, waiting, that Burdock's death was no freak animal attack. But I bit my tongue, just nodded meekly and mumbled my thanks. I knew when I was being politely dismissed, and frankly I was only too happy to oblige. The nightmares began almost immediately. Night after night, I bolted awake in a cold sweat, fragments of disturbing dreams still clinging to my consciousness like cobwebs. Trees with grasping, claw-tipped branches, hulking shadows crashing through the underbrush, a wet ripping sound and a gurgling scream, and always that oppressive sense of being stalked by an ancient ravenous gaze. I made the long drive back to the city in a daze, Burdock's blood-splattered face and Garza's warning echoing through my mind. At home I tried to settle back into my old routine, the 9-to-5 grind, microwave dinners, too much whiskey and not enough sleep. But I couldn't shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted, a dark veil lifted to reveal the savage teeth of an uncaring universe. The familiar rhythms of my life felt hollow, flimsy camouflage stretched over an inky primal void. After a week of increasingly sleepless nights and coffee-fueled days, I hit a breaking point. I couldn't keep going like this, jumping at every creak of the floorboards and flinching from my own shadow. I needed answers, needed to make sense of the insensible, and I knew just where to start looking. The first few pages contained mundane notes about trail conditions and wildlife sightings. Burdock's tight, spidery handwriting marching across the weathered pages in orderly lines. But as I delved deeper, the entries grew darker, more disturbed. Steeling my nerves with a generous slug of bourbon, I upended Burdock's backpack on my kitchen table. Most of it was standard hiking fare, dehydrated rations, a basic first aid kit, water purification tablets, a compass. But buried at the very bottom, wedged between a rumpled slicker and an extra pair of socks, I found a small leather-bound journal. Hands trembling slightly, I cracked it open and began to read. The final entry was just 2 words, scrawled in a shaking hand. "It's here." The next entry chilled me to the bone. "It's getting closer. Can smell it sometimes on the breeze. A fetid reek of decay and damp fur, like death itself gone feral. Woke to find clawed footprints circling my tent. I'm being hunted. May God have mercy on my soul." "Something's out there," he'd written, the words slanting drunkenly across the page. "Watching me. I hear it at night, moving in the trees." catch glimpses of its eyes reflecting the moonlight. It's not a bear, not a cougar. Something else, something wrong. I slammed the journal shut, pulse pounding in my ears. There was no denying it now. The thing that had stalked Burdock, savaged him and left him as a macabre warning, it was real, and it was still out there somewhere, prowling the Gila in search of new prey. A desperate half-formed idea seized me and wouldn't let go. I had to go back, had to see for myself, get proof of the creature's existence. Maybe then I could find a way to stop it before it claimed any more innocent lives. It was madness, sheer suicidal folly, but I didn't care. I was a man possessed. I made my preparations with a grim sense of purpose, bought myself a shiny new rifle, enough ammo to take down a rogue elephant, studied topographical maps of the wilderness until I could trace the craggy contours of canyons and mesas in my sleep, and reached out to the one person who might just be desperate or crazy enough to join me on this ill-advised quest, Deputy Ramona Garza. The sun was just starting its slow descent towards the serrated horizon when I pulled into the parking lot of a shabby roadside diner on the outskirts of Silver City. The flickering neon sign above the door read, "Cactus Jacks" in sputtering green letters, half of them long since burnt out. I killed the engine, and just sat for a moment, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel as I scanned the mostly deserted lot. A couple of beat-up pickup trucks, a rusty VW van that had seen better decades. No sign of Garza. I was just about to give up and head inside when a cloud of dust billowed up from the access road, and a battered Jeep Cherokee came bouncing into view. It screeched to a halt a few spaces down from me, the driver's side door swinging open to reveal a familiar slight figure in a khaki uniform. Deputy Ramona Garza, right on time. Much to my surprise, she agreed to meet. And so 2 weeks to the day since I'd first stumbled across Burdock's bloody remains, I found myself once again bumping down the dusty backroads of New Mexico. But this time, I wasn't some hapless wanderer. I was a man with a mission, and heaven help any beast that tried to stand in my way. She strode over to my car, one hand resting casually on the butt of her service pistol. Even in the fading light I could see the sharp angles of her face, the wary set of her dark eyes as she sized me up through the windshield. I popped the door and climbed out, hands held carefully away from my body. The last thing I needed was to spook her with any sudden moves. "Deputy Garza," I said, inclining my head in greeting. "Thanks for meeting me." She didn't return my smile, just gave a curt nod. "You said you had information about the Burdock case. I'm listening." I reached slowly into my jacket pocket and withdrew the dead man's journal, holding it out to her like a peace offering. "I found this in his backpack. I think you should read it." I barked a humorless laugh. "I think we're a bit beyond cougars and bears here, Deputy. You read the same thing I did. This is no ordinary predator we're talking about." Garza took the battered little book, flipping it open and scanning a few pages with a deepening frown. When she looked up at me again, there was a new intensity in her gaze, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. "This is disturbing," she said carefully, as if weighing each word. "If even half of what Burdock wrote is true, we could be dealing with a highly dangerous animal, possibly even a new species." I took a step closer, holding her gaze without blinking. "Then come back out there with me. Help me track this thing. Find the truth. You're the only one who's taken this seriously from the start. The only one I trust to watch my back. Please, Ramona, I need your help." She closed the journal with a snap, her mouth set in a grim line. "Look, I'll admit there are some oddities about this case. The savagery of the attack, the lack of tracks or scat at the scene. But I'm a cop, not a cryptozoologist. I deal in facts, not flights of fancy." For a long moment she just stared at me, searchlight eyes boring into mine like she could sift through the very contents of my soul. Then at last she gave a slow nod. "All right," she said, a hint of steel threading through her tone. "We'll do this your way, Mr. LN, but we do it smart, we do it careful. And if I say fall back, you damn well better listen. I'm not about to have your blood on my hands, you hear?" She glanced over her shoulder at the sinking sun, the sky slowly purpling into dusk. "First light tomorrow. I'll clear my schedule, take a few personal days. Meet me at the ranger station at dawn. And Mr. LN." "Loud and clear," I said, trying not to let my relief show too plainly on my face. "So, when do we start?" "Yeah? Bring that fancy new rifle of yours. Something tells me we're going to need it." And with that ominous pronouncement hanging in the air between us, she turned on her heel and stalked back to her jeep without so much as a backward glance. I watched her taillights disappear into the gathering dark, a queasy mix of anticipation and dread churning in my gut. Come hell or high water, I'd begun this hunt. Now all that remained was to see it through, to the bitter, bloody end. Morning came all too soon, the anemic light of dawn barely denting the gloaming shadows of the Gila. I was waiting at the ranger station when Garza pulled up in her jeep, clutching a thermos of strong black coffee like a holy relic. I'd barely slept a wink, too keyed up with nerves and morbid imaginings. From the pinched set of her features and the purple smudges under her eyes, I guessed the deputy hadn't fared much better. We set out with grim purpose, hiking in silence through the mist-wreathed trees. I led the way to Burdock's ravaged campsite, steeling myself for the grisly tableau I knew awaited us. But even the lurid embellishments of my nightmares hadn't prepared me for the sight of the scattered debris, the ripped and blood-stiffened tatters of the tent. Death hung heavy on the air, thick and cloying at the back of my throat. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak around the hard lump of dread lodged in my chest. We picked up Burdock's trail, leading deeper into the back country, noting the occasional splash of rusty brown on the leaves, a scrap of cloth snagged on a thorny branch. Then, maybe half a mile from the crime scene, we found the first print. To her credit, Garza barely flinched. She moved methodically through the carnage, snapping photos, bagging samples with a clinical detachment I could only envy. Whatever did this was big, she remarked, crouching to examine a ragged swatch of fabric, and extremely powerful. Look at the force needed to rend this nylon. Something that had no name in any human tongue, but hungered nonetheless for our warm flesh and bright terror. I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I just didn't want to give voice to the primal fears swirling behind my eyes. Nightmare visions of something ancient and obscene lurking in the primeval shadows of the world. Something that had no... It was like no animal track I'd ever seen. A deep gouge in the soft earth nearly 2 feet long. The splayed toes were tipped with viciously curved claws. The pad eerily human-like in its breadth and contours. Garza measured it against her own boot, a bleak smile twisting her lips. Bigger than a grizzly, she said softly, an undercurrent of awe threaded through the words. What the hell are we dealing with here? By mid-afternoon, we stumbled across another abandoned campsite. The scene eerily similar to Burdock's. Shredded tent, scattered gear, dark stains soaked into the loam. A quick check of a discarded wallet confirmed my worst suspicions. The mauled remnants had once belonged to a young couple, avid hikers who'd been reported missing over a month ago. No bodies, but the gruesome detritus of frenzied violence told the tale well enough. Garza's face was grim, her knuckles white on the grip of her drawn sidearm. This is no longer just an animal attack, she gritted out. This is a goddamned killing spree, and we're walking right into the lion's den. We pressed on, following the grim trail ever deeper into the wilderness. The sense of being watched, of some malevolent presence dogging our every step, grew more oppressive with each passing mile. The very trees seemed to crowd closer, their gnarled branches grasping and clawing at our clothes. An unnatural hush lay over the forest, broken only by the occasional harsh cry of a crow, the scurrying of small creatures through the underbrush. I swallowed hard, my own fingers tightening convulsively around the stock of my rifle. But I couldn't turn back. Not now, not when we were so close. The beast had to be stopped, no matter the cost. I owed that much to Burdock, to the nameless missing, to myself. And so we soldiered on, 2 lonely pinpricks of determined humanity in a vast, pitiless wilderness. The shadows lengthened, the light taking on the sepia tinge of old photographs. My every nerve was strung taut as piano wire, senses straining for any hint of movement, of threat. It was almost a relief when we finally found the den. The reek hit us first, a noxious miasma of putrefaction and musk so thick it coated the tongue. We followed our noses to a narrow ravine choked with scrubby brush, the bones of the earth rising sharply to either side. There, half concealed behind a jumble of moss-slick boulders, gaped a jagged fissure in the stone. A rank draught billowed from that dark maw, carrying with it the unmistakable sweet ripe stench of carrion. We exchanged a loaded glance, pulses beating in tandem, the lair of the beast. Garza unclipped a heavy-duty flashlight from her belt, thumb hovering over the switch. I chambered around in my Winchester, the oiled click unnaturally loud in that charged silence. Together we advanced on that waiting void, the very air seeming to thrum with a subliminal growl. My blood roared in my ears, fight-or-flight instinct screaming to turn tail and run, but I quelled it savagely, forced my leaden feet to keep plodding forward. There could be no turning back now, not with my sanity hanging by a thread and the savage killer still on the loose. Whatever awaited us in that Stygian abyss, I would meet it head-on. A bone-rattling roar exploded from the depths of the cavern, the sound slamming into us like a physical blow. Garza's flashlight beam stabbed wildly into the darkness, catching a glimpse of shaggy fur, the wet gleam of teeth and eyes. Then the thing was rushing towards us, a juggernaut of primal fury and rent flesh. Time seemed to slow, syrup thick and crystalline. I saw its massive head swing towards me, jaws dripping gobbets of gore, saw Garza's pistol barking fire, bullets sparking off the rock walls, felt the sear of pain as a swipe of scimitar claws opened my shoulder to the bone. At the lip of the cave mouth, Garza paused, casting me a searching sideways look. "Last chance to back out," she said, and I couldn't tell if it was an offer or a challenge. "There's no shame in finesse." I fell back, scrabbling for my rifle, some distant part of my brain marveling at how the wet crunch of the beast's teeth in my arm sounded so very similar to a man biting into a ripe apple. Then Garza was there, dragging me clear, shoving the gun into my bleeding hands. "Shoot, damn it," she screamed, desperation and terror cracking her voice. Operating on pure instinct, I brought the rifle to my shoulder, pointed it at the heaving bulk of the creature, drew a bead on that nightmare visage, the dripping ruin of its throat, squeezed the trigger once, twice, the kick of the recoil jarring me to the core. The thing jerked and stumbled, dark ichor spraying, but kept coming, an avid hunger burning in its mindless gaze. I fired again, aiming for the malformed skull, the gory eye sockets. On the fifth shot, something finally broke behind those twin pits of hell. With a keening wail, the abomination folded in on itself and crashed to the blood-slick stone, twitching like a beetle on a pin. In the sudden ringing silence that followed, I could hear the rasp of Garza's breathing, the click of her gun's hammer as she kept it trained unwaveringly on the fallen behemoth. Slowly, painfully, I levered myself to my feet, clamping one shaking hand over the weeping ruin of my shoulder. Together we limped cautiously closer to the motionless bulk, the stink of its death washing over us in noxious waves. Bile scorched the back of my throat as the awful realization crashed over me. This wasn't just some feral creature, warped by injury or inbreeding to freakish proportions and unnatural appetites. No, this living nightmare had once been human, had walked and talked and thought as a man, before succumbing to the twisted hungers of the beast within. What unimaginable torment must Burdock have suffered in his final moments, as his body and mind were perverted into the very thing that he'd feared. Dear God in heaven, I'd never seen anything like it. It was a perversion of all natural law, a twisted amalgamation of man and beast in some fouler, blacker thing, easily 9 feet tall, with a barrel chest and grossly elongated limbs knotted with ropey muscle under its matted pelt. The head was misshapen, almost canine, trap-like jaws bristling with jagged teeth the length of hunting knives. Intelligence glittered in its glazed porcine eyes, a malign awareness utterly at odds with its animalistic form. But by far the most horrific thing was the tattered remnants of clothing still clinging to its grotesque frame. A plaid flannel shirt stretched to bursting around its massive torso, shredded denim encasing its backward-bending legs, the cruel mockery of a man's hiking boots, split at the seams by taloned paws. I turned away, retching helplessly, dimly aware of Garza doing the same a few feet away. In that moment of agonized revelation, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that the scars we carried away from this day would run soul-deep, indelible, and unhealing, that no amount of distance or drink or denials could ever erase the image of that obscene, chittering thing wearing a man's skin like an ill-fitting costume. We burned the corpse where it lay, dousing it liberally with accelerant and setting it alight with hands that shook only slightly. As the greasy smoke spiraled into the uncaring sky, I saw a glimmer of something like understanding in Garza's haunted eyes, an echo of my own horrified epiphany. There were older and fouler things than wolves or wildcats prowling the untamed corners of the world, hungering for the warm blood and bright terror of mortal men, things that had no place in a sane and rational universe, but clung tenaciously to the shadows nonetheless. In the end, they closed off that cursed section of the Gila, posted warnings about animal attacks and unsafe hiking conditions, Life went on, the fickle eye of the world soon turning to fresher tragedies and brighter distractions. But for Deputy Garza and me, there was no moving on, no unseeing what we'd witnessed in that charnel cave. She eventually left the force, unable to endure the way every shadow and rustle in the night conjured visions of fang and claw. I retreated into a bottle, pickling my demons in whiskey fumes and chasing monsters to the bottom of each empty glass. The trip back to civilization was a blur, pain and shock and sickened revulsion blunting the edges of everything. We concocted a hasty story about a rabid bear, made all the necessary calls and reports, and if our voices shook as we repeated the lie over and over, who could blame us? There were some truths too terrible to be borne, some horrors too profane for the light of day. The Wendigo walks, you see. It shambles through the lonely woods and forgotten hollows, dead eyes burning with the cold feral light of the stars. And it hungers, oh how it hungers, for the sweet marrow of innocence, the hot salt tang of mortal dread. It wears our skins and speaks with our stolen voices, vomits forth our undigested hopes and dreams in spatters of bile and gore. Because I know in my shriveled, weary heart that the thing that had once been Stanley Burdock wasn't the only one of its kind, that it was only a harbinger, a herald of horrors yet to come. The wild places of the world hold secrets older than stone, hungers more ancient than civilization itself, and heaven help the poor bastards unlucky enough to stumble across them unawares. And yet, even now, decades later and a lifetime removed from that red-soaked glade, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder on moonless nights, searching the tree line for a shaggy silhouette, a brandished blade of shining teeth, wondering how many of the lost and the lonely have been dragged away to glut the unclean appetites of the dark. How many hikers and transients and drifters simply vanished into the hungry maw of the forest, never to be seen again. Because someone has to remember, to stand witness against the hungry dark, to light a feeble candle against the encroaching gloom and howl defiance with a throat gone raw from screaming. And who better than a damned old drunk with nothing left to lose and the stench of an atavistic evil forever seared into his mind? And it will never ever stop. Not until the last whimpering cry fades to silence. The last skull is picked clean and gleaming. Until all the world is its hunting ground and slaughterhouse. One endless charnel forest echoing with the screams of the damned and the dying. And I'll be waiting for it, sitting by my cache of bullets and bottles, a loaded gun cradled in my shaking hands, keeping my vigil through the long, cold nights, watching the tree line with feverish eyes, praying for the first twitch of movement, the first huff of fetid breath. So here I sit, stewing in my own sweat and paranoia, bracing for a fight I know I can never win. Waiting for the soft tread of twisted feet through the fallen leaves, the glint of an antler-crowned silhouette looming against the moon. Muttering a prayer to a god I no longer believe in, just 3 words repeated over and over like a drunkard's barroom chant. Come on, you son of a bitch. I'm ready for you. Come on. The sun was setting, painting the New Mexico sky in vivid shades of orange and red. The desert stretched out before us, an endless sea of red dust and scrubby vegetation, broken only by the distant silhouettes of mountains that never seemed to get any closer no matter how long we drove. I was half asleep in the passenger seat of Caleb's beat-up old SUV, lulled by the monotonous rumble of the engine and the warmth of the fading sunlight on my face. We'd been on the road for hours, just like every other day of this aimless post-college road trip that had somehow stretched from a summer whim into a way of life. Not that there had been any college for either of us. Caleb had grown up on his family's farm in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, and had never seen much point in higher education when there was always work to be done on the land. As for me, well, that's a story for another time. Let's just say my roots are a tangled mess I try not to dwell on too much. We'd met a couple of years back, 2 drifters working odd jobs to keep gas in the tank and food in our bellies. Caleb was the kind of guy who could make friends with a rock, always ready with a grin and a helping hand, even for a scruffy, closed-off type like me. Somewhere along the line, we'd fallen into an easy companionship, the kind that doesn't ask too many questions. And so, when the leaves began to turn and the nights grew colder, it had seemed only natural to point the SUV south, chasing the promise of warmth and adventure. We'd picked up work where we could, apple picking in Oregon, a stint on a fishing boat in California, even a couple of weeks on an oil rig in Texas, but mostly we just drove, letting the road take us where it would. On this particular day, we were headed for some national park Caleb had read about, a place of towering rock formations and ancient petroglyphs hidden in the desert. The name escapes me now, lost in the haze of events that followed. What I do remember is the moment Caleb spotted that weathered old sign, Masonic Springs. He read aloud, his voice taking on that slightly dreamy quality it always did when he sensed something mystical in the air. Sounds intriguing. What do you say we take a little detour, Everin? I cracked an eye open, taking in the narrow dirt road that branched off from the highway, winding into a landscape that looked like it hadn't changed since the dawn of time. I don't know, man, I said, heaving myself up straighter in my seat. We're not exactly equipped for off-roading. What if we get stuck out there? But Caleb just grinned, that irrepressible spark of mischief dancing in his eyes. Where's your sense of adventure? Come on, it'll be fun. And who knows, maybe we'll stumble across some ancient secrets or something. I should have argued more. Should have insisted we stick to the plan, to the safety of the known road. But there was something in Caleb's enthusiasm that was hard to resist, a kind of infectious joy in the unknown. And if I'm being honest, there was a part of me that wanted to believe in his vision of the world, a place where every dirt track held the promise of magic and revelation. So, with a shrug and a half-hearted grumble, I settled back into my seat as Caleb turned the wheel, sending us bouncing and jostling down the narrow winding path. Little did I know that in that moment, with that simple acquiescence, I had sealed our fates. That dirt road was leading us straight into the heart of a nightmare, from which there would be no easy escape. But in the golden light of that fading New Mexico afternoon, with the wind whipping through the open windows and Caleb singing along to some half-forgotten country tune on the radio, it was easy to believe that the road would go on forever, that nothing truly bad could touch us out here in the vast expanse of the American West. Oh, how wrong I was. If only I had known then what horrors lay in wait, lurking in the lengthening shadows of the desert. If only I had heeded that tiny nagging voice of caution that whispered at the back of my mind as the highway receded in the rearview mirror, and the untamed wilderness closed in around us. But I was young and foolish and drunk on the heady elixir of freedom, and so I let the road carry us forward, deeper and deeper into the uncharted territory of fate and circumstance, until it was far too late to turn back. The sun was just kissing the horizon, painting the desert in shades of fiery orange and deep purple when I first saw the buildings. At first I thought they were just another trick of the light, shimmering mirages conjured by the heat-addled air, but as we bumped and jolted along the dirt track, they solidified into squat, weathered structures, their adobe walls half sunken into the parched earth. Whoa, stop, I said, straightening up in my seat as I peered through the dust-caked windshield. Do you see that? Caleb brought the SUV to a lurching halt, leaning forward to get a better look. There was a knowing glint in his eye, a hint of that same spiritualist zeal that had led us down this godforsaken road in the first place. Looks like some kind of old settlement, he said, his voice hushed with something like reverence. Maybe even ruins from the Spanish colonial days. Can you imagine the history here, the stories these walls could tell? I could, and that was the problem. There was something about the scene before us, the way the buildings seemed to hunch into the earth, the eerie stillness that hung over the place like a shroud, that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the kind of stillness that only exists in places long abandoned by the living, places where the veil between worlds grows thin and tattered. But Caleb was already opening his door, his long legs unfolding from the driver's seat with a creak of denim and a stretch of muscles too long confined. Come on, he said, flashing me that grin that always made me want to follow him, no matter how foolhardy the venture. Let's go check it out. Against my better judgment, I found myself trailing after him, the SUV's door slamming shut behind me with a sound that echoed across the empty expanse of the desert. The sun was dipping lower now, its dying rays painting the adobe walls in shades of blood and shadow. The air had taken on a chill, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. We picked our way through the rubble and the drifts of red dust, towards the nearest of the structures. Up close I could see the rough, hand-hewn nature of the walls, the way the adobe had cracked and crumbled under the relentless assault of wind and sand and time. My fingers traced the weathered surface, feeling the grit of it, the dry, leached texture that spoke of centuries baking under the merciless sun. And then I saw the symbols. They were carved into the lintel of what must have once been a doorway, rough-hewn and crudely rendered, but unmistakable in their intent. I didn't recognize them, but they radiated a sense of power, of some ancient and unknowable purpose. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a sudden overwhelming urge to turn tail, to flee back to the relative safety of the SUV and the open road. But Caleb was already ducking through the low entry, his form swallowed up by the darkness within. "Come on, Everin," he called, his voice muffled and strangely flat in the dead air. "You've got to see this." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run, to leave this place and its aura of ancient menace far behind. But in the end, the pull of Caleb's enthusiasm, the need to not be the one to break the spell of our shared adventure, won out over caution. With a deep breath and a muttered curse, I stepped over the threshold and into the waiting shadows. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, laden with the scent of dust and something else, something rank and feral that caught at the back of my throat. It was dark, the only light filtering in through chinks and gaps in the crumbling walls. But as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the vague shape of the room, the uneven dirt floor and the sagging beams of the ceiling. And then I saw the eyes. They glowed in the deepest shadows, a sickly luminous orange that seemed to pulse with a malevolent inner fire. At first I thought they were embers, some trick of the fading light. But then they moved and I heard the soft shuffle of something large and heavy shifting in the darkness. "Caleb," I whispered, my voice cracking with sudden icy fear. "Caleb, there's something in here." But Caleb wasn't listening. He was moving towards those terrible, glowing eyes, his hand outstretched as if in supplication, his face a mask of rapturous wonder. "Caleb, no," I hissed, lunging forward to grab his arm. But it was too late. The thing in the shadows moved, faster than my eye could follow, and suddenly it was there, looming over us like a nightmare made flesh. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with a hulking, misshapen form that seemed to blur and shift at the edges, as if it were not quite solid. Its body was covered in matted fur, a dark, oily pelt that glistened wetly in the half-light. But it was the head that froze the blood in my veins, that sent a scream bubbling up in my throat. It was elongated, almost canine, but with a wrong, twisted aspect that spoke of something far more sinister than any wolf or coyote. The muzzle was too long, the teeth too sharp and too numerous, jutting at odd angles from blackened gums. And the eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, they burned with a feral predatory hunger that seemed to strip the soul bare. I stood there paralyzed with terror, as the thing took a step forward, its claws scraping against the packed earth of the floor. A low guttural growl rumbled up from its chest, a sound that vibrated in my bones, that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And then, as if a spell had been broken, Caleb screamed. It was a sound I will never forget, a high, piercing wail of pure, primal fear. The thing lunged, its jaws snapping shut with a sickening crunch, and suddenly the air was filled with the coppery scent of blood. I don't remember running. I don't remember clawing my way back through the doorway, out into the dying light of the desert evening. All I remember is the blind, animal panic, the need to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that hulking, furred horror. I ran, stumbling and sliding in the loose sand, my lungs burning and my heart slamming against my ribs. Behind me, I could hear the thing giving chase, its heavy tread shaking the earth, its ragged breathing hot on the back of my neck. I had a vague impression of Caleb shouting something, his voice high and thready with pain and fear, but I couldn't make out the words over the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. All I knew was that I had to keep running, had to find some way to escape the nightmare that had overtaken us. And then, by some miracle, I saw it. The mouth of a low cave, half hidden behind a tumble of boulders, a black gash in the red rock of the desert. I didn't hesitate, didn't stop to think. I just threw myself forward, scrabbling on hands and knees over the rough stone, plunging headlong into the cool, musty darkness. I heard Caleb cry out behind me, a sound that was abruptly cut off by a wet, meaty thud. I felt hot tears streaming down my face, blurring my vision. But I didn't dare stop. I just kept crawling, dragging myself deeper and deeper into the narrow, winding passage. And then, just as I felt the fetid breath of the thing on my heels, just as I braced myself for the searing pain of teeth and claws, my hand found empty air. I tumbled forward, falling through a narrow crevice and out into a tangle of thorny scrub and red dust on the other side. For a moment I just lay there gasping and shaking, waiting for the end. But it didn't come. The thing, whatever it was, must have been too large to follow me through that final narrow gap. I heard it snarling and scrabbling at the rock, its frustrated howls echoing off the canyon walls, but I was safe, at least for the moment. I don't know how long I lay there, my face pressed into the gritty earth, my body racked with silent sobs. It could have been minutes, or hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, swallowed up in the enormity of the horror I had just witnessed. But eventually, as the last of the light faded from the sky and the stars began to wheel overhead, I dragged myself to my feet. I was still shaking, my mind reeling as it tried to process the impossible events of the last few hours. But beneath the shock and the grief, a new emotion was rising up in me, cold and implacable as steel. Anger. Rage at the thing that had taken Caleb, that had shattered the fragile peace of our aimless wanderings. And beneath that, a grim, stubborn determination. I would survive this. I would find a way to go on, to carry the memory of Caleb with me like a talisman against the darkness. I staggered through the night, following the faint gleam of starlight reflected off the SUV's windshield. It was a miracle I found it at all. A tiny island of normalcy in the vast, pitiless sea of the desert. But find it I did, and with trembling hands I wrenched open the door and flung myself inside. The keys were still in the ignition, a small mercy. I turned them with numb fingers, feeling a wash of relief as the engine coughed to life. And then I was driving, the tires spraying gravel and sand as I pointed the nose of the SUV back towards the highway, back towards the thin veneer of civilization that suddenly seemed so fragile, so infinitely precious. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a plan, or a destination. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to put as much distance as possible between myself and the nightmare I had left behind in the desert. And so I drove, through the night and into the pale, tentative dawn, the events of the past few hours playing over and over in my mind like a horror movie stuck on repeat. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing orange eyes, the rank, fetid stench of the thing's breath, the sound of Caleb's final desperate scream. It was a wound that would never fully heal, a scar on my psyche that would throb and ache for the rest of my days. But as the miles fell away beneath my wheels, and the desert gave way to the first hints of human habitation, I made a silent vow to myself. I would find a way to go on. I would carry Caleb's memory with me, a bright shining light to ward off the shadows that lurked at the edges of my consciousness. And someday, somehow, I would find a way to make sense of the horror that had overtaken us, to give meaning to the sacrifice my friend had made. Little did I know then just how long and twisted that path would be, or how deep into the darkness it would lead me. But in that moment, with the sun rising over the horizon and the open road stretching out before me, I felt the first stirrings of a grim, implacable purpose. I would survive. I would remember. And I would never, ever stop searching for the truth behind the nightmare that had claimed Caleb's life. No matter how long it took, or how far I had to go, I would find a way to bring some light to the shadows that had swallowed him whole. It was a promise I made to myself, there in the pale light of that desert dawn, a promise that would shape the course of my life for years to come, leading me down paths I could never have imagined in my wildest dreams or darkest nightmares. But that is a story for another time. For now, it is enough to know that I survived, that I found a way to carry on in the face of the unspeakable, and that somewhere out there, in the vast, uncharted expanses of the American West, the thing that took Caleb is still lurking, waiting for its next unwary prey. May God have mercy on anyone unlucky enough to cross its path, because I know with a bone-deep certainty that it will show none, and that knowledge, that grim acceptance of the darkness that walks among us, is the burden I will carry with me for the rest of my days. The days that followed my escape from that desert nightmare were a blur of pain and paranoia. I drove until the SUV ran out of gas, then hitched rides with truckers and drifters, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting to see those glowing orange eyes staring out at me from the darkness. I didn't have a destination in mind. I was running on pure instinct, a primal need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the horror I had left behind. But eventually, as the miles fell away and the adrenaline faded, I found myself drifting towards the small towns and truck stops that dot the highways of the American West. It was in one of these places, a little diner clinging to the edge of a dusty Nevada town, that I first met Elias. I had been there for a few weeks, working odd jobs in the kitchen and trying to lose myself in the monotony of the daily grind. But even there, in the harsh fluorescent light and the chatter of the regulars, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of some dark presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I was bussing tables one evening when he walked in, a tall, weather-beaten man with a quiet intensity about him. He had the look of someone who had seen things, who had stared into the abyss and come out the other side. He ordered a coffee, black, and settled into a booth in the corner, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced, wary gaze. I don't know what it was that drew me to him. Maybe it was the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else who had brushed up against the unknown and been forever changed by it. Or maybe it was just desperation, a need to unburden myself of the weight of my experiences to someone, anyone who might understand. Whatever the reason, I found myself drifting over to his table, coffee pot in hand. "Refill?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. He looked up at me, his eyes a piercing blue under the brim of his battered cowboy hat. For a long moment, he just studied me, as if he could see straight through to the haunted, broken places inside. Then he nodded, pushing his mug towards me. "Much obliged," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You look like you've got a story to tell, kid." I don't know what made me trust him. Maybe it was the understanding in his eyes, the sense that he had walked the same dark paths that I had. Or maybe I was just so desperate for someone to believe me, to validate the horror of what I had experienced, that I would have poured my heart out to anyone who showed the slightest interest. Whatever the reason, I found myself sliding into the booth across from him, the words spilling out of me in a rush. I told him everything, from the aimless wanderings that had brought Caleb and me to that fateful crossroads, to the nightmare creature in the ruins, and the desperate, terrifying flight that had followed. Through it all, he listened in silence, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finally ran out of words, he leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Skinwalker," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's what you saw out there, kid. A creature of pure evil, born of ancient magic and dark rituals." I felt a chill run down my spine at the word. I had heard whispers of skinwalkers before, half-remembered stories from my childhood, tales of shape-shifting witches who could take on the form of animals, but I had always dismissed them as mere folklore, the superstitions of a primitive pre-scientific age. Now, with the memory of those glowing orange eyes still seared into my mind, I wasn't so sure. "You've seen them before," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Haven't you?" Elias nodded, his gaze distant. "More times than I care to remember," he said. "I've been hunting them for years, ever since one of them took someone I loved. It's a hard road, kid, and a lonely one. But it's the only way to keep others safe, to stop these things before they can claim more innocent lives." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a kind of grim understanding. "I can see it in you," he said softly. "The same thing that drives me. The need for answers, for vengeance, the willingness to stare into the darkness, no matter the cost to your own soul." I felt a lump rise in my throat, a sudden overwhelming surge of emotion. Here, at last, was someone who understood, who had walked the same path of grief and obsession. "Teach me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Teach me how to hunt them, how to stop them. I can't let what happened to Caleb happen to anyone else." Elias studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "It won't be easy," he warned. "This life, it takes a toll, on your mind, your body, your very soul. You'll see things that will haunt you, that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. But if you're sure, if you're willing to walk this path, I'll show you what I know." And so began my apprenticeship, my long, slow descent into the shadow world that exists just beyond the edges of our own. Elias taught me everything he knew, from the ancient lore of the skinwalkers to the practical skills of tracking and combat. We traveled the back roads and byways of the West, following the trail of strange sightings and unsolved disappearances, always searching for any sign of the creature that had taken Caleb. It was a hard life, a lonely life. We spent long weeks camping in the wilderness, subsisting on whatever we could hunt or scavenge. We faced danger at every turn, not just from the skinwalkers themselves, but from the harsh realities of life on the fringes of society. But through it all, I found a kind of grim purpose, a sense of meaning that had been missing from my life since that fateful night in the desert. I was a hunter now, a guardian of the innocent, a lone light shining in the darkness. And though the road was long and the shadows deep, I knew that I would never turn back, never rest until I had found a way to bring justice to the memory of my lost friend. Years passed and the trail grew colder, but still we pressed on, driven by a stubborn, unyielding determination. And then one night, as we camped under the stars in the high desert of New Mexico, we heard it. A howl, long and mournful, echoing off the canyon walls. A sound that I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, belonged to the creature that had haunted my dreams for so long. We tracked it for days, following the faint, elusive signs of its passage. And then, finally, we found it. It was holed up in a cave in the heart of the desert, a place of ancient, primal darkness. We approached with caution, our weapons at the ready, our hearts pounding in our chests. The battle that followed was fierce and desperate, a primal struggle for survival against a creature of pure, malevolent evil. In the end, we emerged victorious, the skinwalker's lifeless body lying at our feet, its orange eyes staring sightlessly at the desert sky. But the victory was hard won, and not without cost. Elias was badly wounded, his body broken by the creature's savage claws. As I knelt beside him, cradling his head in my lap, he looked up at me with a faint, pained smile. "You did good, kid," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind.
You did real good. But this fight, it's not over. There's always another one out there, always another shadow to chase. Promise me? Promise me you'll keep going, keep fighting. For Caleb, for all the ones we couldn't save.
I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I promise," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "I won't stop, not until my last breath. I'll keep the light shining, no matter how dark the night gets." Elias smiled, a last faint flicker of life in his fading eyes. And then he was gone, his body growing still and cold in my arms. I buried him there, in the heart of the desert he had loved so well. And then I set out alone, my heart heavy with grief but my resolve unshaken. I was a hunter now, a guardian of the innocent, a lone light shining in the darkness. And though the road ahead was long and the shadows deep, I knew that I would never turn back, never rest until I had fulfilled the promise I had made to my friend and mentor. And so I wander still, following the rumors and whispers, always searching for signs of the skinwalkers and their dark, twisted magic. It's a hard life, a lonely life, but it's the only one I know, the only one that gives meaning to the pain and loss I have endured. Sometimes in the long, cold nights I think of Caleb, of the laughter and the light that was snuffed out so cruelly in the desert all those years ago. And I think of Elias, of the grim, unyielding determination that drove him, of the sacrifices he made to keep the innocent safe from the horrors that lurk in the shadows. They are my guiding stars, my constant companions on this long, lonely road. And though I know that I may never find peace, never be free of the burden I have taken on, I also know that I will never stop fighting, never stop searching for the light in the darkness. For I am a hunter, a guardian, a lone warrior standing against the tide of evil that threatens to engulf us all. And as long as there is breath in my body and fire in my heart, I will never ever give up the fight. My name is Wohali Sequoia, eagle who soars above the written word, and I am the fourth generation of my family to serve as guardian of these ancient mountains. The Cherokee blood that flows through my veins carries the memory of every tree, every stream, and every shadow that dwells within the Deep Pine National Forest of western North Carolina. My great-grandfather used to tell me that our people were placed here not just to protect the forest, but to maintain the balance between the world of men and the world of things that should remain hidden. For 15 years, I have served as head park ranger of this 40,000-acre wilderness, where the mist clings to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping spirits. Most visitors see only the beauty, the cascading waterfalls, the pristine hiking trails, the black bears that lumber through clearings at dusk. They do not see what I see. They do not hear the warnings that echo through the valleys when the wind shifts just right, carrying with it the scent of something ancient and wild. The call came in at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October, when the autumn chill had already begun to bite through even the thickest ranger jacket. Sarah Martinez, my communications officer, sounded shaken when she radioed me at my cabin. "Well, Holly, we've got a situation. Family of 4. The Hendersons from Charlotte failed to return from their camping trip. They were supposed to check out yesterday morning." I was already reaching for my boots before she finished speaking. Missing persons cases in Deep Pine were rare, but they carried a weight that settled deep in my chest like cold stones. Where were they camping? Site 47, up near Ravens Hollow. My blood went cold. Ravens Hollow sat at the edge of what my grandmother had called the quiet places, areas where even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, where the very air felt thick with watching eyes. The Cherokee have a name for such places. Nviayeli, the breathing ground where the earth itself seems alive with something that does not welcome human presence. "I'll assemble a search team," I said, but Sarah's voice crackled back with urgency. "There's more, Wohali. The campground manager said he found their campsite this morning. Everything was still there. Tent, gear, food. But it looked like they'd left in a hurry. And there were tracks. What kind of tracks?" The silence stretched long enough that I thought we'd lost connection. When Sarah's voice returned, it was barely above a whisper. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. 18 inches long, maybe more. And deep like whatever made them was carrying a lot of weight. I closed my eyes and felt the familiar chill that had haunted my family for generations. My great-grandfather had warned me about such tracks, about the times when the Sulkalu, the ancient guardians of the deep forest, revealed themselves to the world of men. He called them the keepers of the game, beings that had walked these mountains since before the Cherokee first glimpsed their peaks. Usually they remained hidden, content to observe from the shadows. When they revealed themselves, it meant the balance had been disturbed. Within an hour I had assembled my best team. Jake Morrison, a former Marine with tracking skills that bordered on supernatural. Elena Vasquez, our emergency medical technician who could navigate the most treacherous terrain without breaking stride. And Tommy Crowfeather, my cousin and the only other person on my team who understood the old stories and their significance. As we loaded our gear in the pre-dawn darkness, Tommy pulled me aside. His weathered face was etched with concern, and when he spoke it was in the Cherokee tongue of our childhood. "Ozda sonale, Wohali, Elohino galisquote, Nagasquote. The darkness is thick, Eagle. Something walks that should not walk." I nodded, feeling the weight of ancestral knowledge settling on my shoulders like a mantle. "You felt it too. For 3 days now, the forest has been quiet. Too quiet. Even the ravens have stopped calling near the hollow." He glanced toward the tree line, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the canopy. "Whatever took them, it's old. Older than the stories." As we drove toward the trailhead, I found myself thinking about the last time tracks like these had been found in Deep Pine. It was 12 years ago, when a group of college students had vanished near the same area. We'd found them 3 days later, wandering on a highway 30 miles away with no memory of how they'd gotten there. They spoke of a tall figure in the trees, watching them, following them, but could provide no other details. The state psychiatric evaluation had classified it as shared psychotic disorder brought on by wilderness exposure and dehydration. I knew better. The trailhead parking area was empty, except for the Henderson silver SUV, sitting exactly where they'd left it 3 days ago. As I approached the vehicle, I noticed the first sign that this would not be an ordinary search and rescue operation. The car's windows were fogged from the inside, despite the cool morning air, and when I peered through the glass, I could see handprints pressed against the interior surfaces, as if someone had been trapped inside, desperately trying to get out. But the doors were unlocked, and there were no signs of struggle around the vehicle. Tommy appeared at my shoulder, his face grim. "Wohali, look at this." He was pointing to the ground beside the driver's door, where the morning dew had settled on the asphalt. There, pressed deep into the soft earth at the edge of the parking area, was a single footprint. It was massive, easily 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide, with what appeared to be toe impressions that were distinctly human in shape but unnaturally elongated. "Jesus," Jake whispered, crouching beside the print. "What the hell made this?" I knelt beside him, studying the impression. The depth and clarity of the track suggested something impossibly heavy had passed this way recently. But it was the other details that made my skin crawl. The way the toes seemed to grip the earth, as if whatever had made the print possessed not just human intelligence but human intent. "We need to move fast," I said, standing and adjusting my pack. "If the Hendersons are still in the forest, they're in danger." As we began our hike toward Raven's Hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet, with none of the usual sounds of wildlife that typically accompanied the dawn hours. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. 3 miles up the trail, Elena made the discovery that confirmed my worst fears. "Ranger Sequoia," she called from a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards off the main path. "You need to see this." When I reached her position, she was standing beside a massive tree trunk, staring upward with an expression of barely controlled terror. Following her gaze, I saw them claw marks gouged deep into the bark, starting about 10 feet up and extending nearly to the tree's crown. The marks were fresh, with sap still weeping from the wounds, and they formed a pattern that suggested something had climbed the tree with deliberate, methodical movements. But it was what I saw at the base of the tree that made my blood run cold. Scattered around the trunk were pieces of clothing, a child's sneaker, a torn fragment of a woman's jacket, and a man's baseball cap. All bore the unmistakable signs of having been removed forcibly, with fabric tears that spoke of great strength applied with frightening precision. "They were here," I said quietly, more to myself than to my team, "but they're not anymore." Tommy emerged from the tree line, his face pale. The tracks continue deeper into the forest. They're heading toward the old-growth section. The old-growth section. My grandmother had warned me never to enter that part of the forest alone, especially not during the dark of the moon. It was there, she said, that the Sul'Kalu had made their home since the beginning of time, in caves and hollow trees that existed beyond the reach of human maps. As we prepared to follow the trail deeper into the wilderness, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of calling for backup, instead of involving federal search and rescue teams who would bring their helicopters and their modern equipment and their complete ignorance of what we were truly hunting, I decided to handle this the way my ancestors would have, with respect for the old ways and an understanding that some hunts require more than human strength. I was about to learn that some hunts also require more than human courage. The deeper we ventured into the old-growth section of deep pine forest, the more the world around us seemed to shift and change in ways that defied natural explanation. The trees here were ancient beyond measure, towering white pines and hemlocks that had been saplings when my ancestors first walked these mountains. Their trunks were so massive that it would take 4 grown men holding hands to encircle them, and their canopy was so dense that even at midday the forest floor existed in a perpetual twilight. But it was the silence that unnerved me the most. In all my years as a ranger, I had never experienced such complete absence of sound. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects, nothing but the soft crunch of our boots on the carpet of pine needles and the occasional whisper of wind through the upper branches. The Hendersons' trail was easy to follow at first. The massive footprints that had appeared alongside their tracks at the campsite continued here, sometimes walking parallel to the family's path, sometimes crossing it, always maintaining what seemed like a deliberate distance. It was Tommy who first noticed the pattern. "Look at this," he said, crouching beside a particularly clear set of impressions. "The big tracks. They're not just following the family, they're herding them." I knelt beside him and studied the ground. He was right. The enormous footprints formed a rough semicircle around the Hendersons' path, gradually converging to force them toward a specific direction, deeper into the forest, away from any marked trails, toward terrain that would make rescue increasingly difficult. "Whatever's doing this," Jake said, his voice tight with tension, "it's smart, military smart." Elena looked up from where she was examining a broken branch. "These breaks are fresh, maybe 6 hours old. And look at the height." She pointed to damage on the trees that extended well above our heads. Gouges and broken limbs that suggested something very tall had passed this way, marking its territory as it moved. We had been hiking for nearly 4 hours when we found the first shelter. It was Tommy who spotted it. A crude lean-to, constructed from fallen branches and pine boughs, hidden in a small clearing about 100 yards off the main deer path. The construction was rough but functional, clearly built by someone with knowledge of wilderness survival techniques. What made it remarkable was not its presence, but its size. The shelter was enormous, easily 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling height that would have accommodated someone over 7 feet tall. The Hendersons, Jake wondered aloud. I shook my head. Look at how the branches are broken off, not cut. And see these footprints around the perimeter? The same massive tracks circled the shelter in a deliberate pattern, as if something had been pacing around it, perhaps considering its construction or marking it as territory. But there were other prints too. The familiar boot treads of hiking shoes, child-sized sneaker impressions, and what appeared to be bare human footprints. They were here, Elena confirmed, pointing to a small pile of granola bar wrappers near what would have been the shelter's entrance. But not by choice. The evidence told a disturbing story. Scattered around the shelter were items that clearly belonged to the Henderson family. A child's stuffed animal, a woman's hair tie, a man's watch with its band torn as if it had been forcibly removed. But there were also other objects that made no sense. Strange arrangements of stones that formed patterns I recognized from my grandmother's stories, bundles of herbs that had been carefully harvested and tied with what appeared to be twisted grass, and carved symbols on nearby trees that resembled no written language I had ever encountered. Tommy, I called, gesturing toward the symbols. Have you seen markings like these before? My cousin approached the carved trees with obvious reluctance, his weathered hands tracing the deep gouges in the bark without actually touching them. When he looked up, his face had gone ashen. These aren't Cherokee, he said quietly. They're older. Much older. He paused, glancing around the clearing as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. My grandfather told me about markings like these. He said they were territorial claims, made by the old ones who walked the forest before our people arrived. The Sul Kalu? He nodded. But if they're making territory markers, it means they're planning to stay. And if they've taken the family... He didn't need to finish the sentence. In the old stories, when the forest guardians claimed humans, it was rarely temporary. We pressed deeper into the wilderness, following a trail that became increasingly difficult to navigate. The massive footprints led us through dense thickets that seemed to part only reluctantly, across rocky streams where the water ran black and ice-cold, and up steep inclines that left us gasping in the thin mountain air. With each mile, I felt the weight of watchful eyes growing heavier, as if the forest itself was aware of our presence and debating whether we represented a threat. It was late afternoon when we heard the first sound that wasn't made by our own passage. A low, resonant call that seemed to emanate from the very mountains themselves. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, neither animal nor human, but something that somehow managed to convey both intelligence and warning. The sound rolled through the forest like distant thunder, causing birds to suddenly burst from the canopy in panicked flight, and sending a family of deer crashing through the underbrush in their haste to escape. That came from ahead of us, Jake whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. Maybe a quarter mile, Elena agreed, but her voice carried a tremor that I had never heard before. Tommy grabbed my arm. Well, Holly, we need to stop, now. The family is still out there. Listen to me. His grip tightened, and when I looked into his eyes, I saw fear that went deeper than concern for the missing hikers. That sound, my grandfather described it to me once. He said it was the voice of the Sul Kalu, when they were calling to each other across the valleys. It means we're in their territory now. Real territory, not just the forest they watch over. So what are you suggesting? That we turn back? I'm suggesting that we're being hunted. As if summoned by his words, a branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind us. We all turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except shadow and the gentle sway of pine boughs in the afternoon breeze. Then another branch broke. This one to our left, followed by the soft whisper of something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the range of our vision. Circle formation, I ordered quietly. Back to back. Elena, get your emergency beacon ready. We formed a tight defensive circle, each of us facing outward into the forest. For several minutes we stood motionless, listening to the subtle sounds of something or someone moving around us in a slowly contracting spiral. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying us, perhaps evaluating whether we posed a threat or represented an opportunity. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow among shadows, a darker patch of forest that seemed to shift and move independently of the wind. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, The shadow resolved into a shape that made my breath catch in my throat. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark, coarse. I've been camping in Arizona since I could carry my own water bottle. The high country around Flagstaff holds no surprises for someone who grew up 30 miles south in the heat. My cousin Tyler and I started doing overnight trips when we hit high school, testing ourselves against the elevation and the October cold that drops like a stone once the sun disappears behind the San Francisco peaks. We'd done Ashurst Lake more times than I could count, worked our way through the dispersed sites around Marshall Lake, and spent quiet nights at pullouts along Lake Mary Road when we just wanted to hear silence and drive home early. The routine had become second nature. Load the Tacoma with our 2-person tent, a cooler that never held more than we could finish in one night, a small bundle of split wood from the gas station, and the old 6-cell Maglite that had lived under my father's truck seat for 15 years before he passed it to me. October 2021 came in dry and clear, the kind of high desert autumn that makes you forget summer ever happened. The Weather Service was calling for a cold front to push through midweek, dropping overnight temperatures into the 20s with clear skies and steady wind. Perfect conditions for a quiet camp, the kind where you can hear your own thoughts and sleep deep enough to wake up genuinely rested. Tyler finished his shift at the auto parts store on Tuesday afternoon, and I wrapped up my route deliveries for the building supply company by 4. We met at my place in Flagstaff, threw our gear in the truck bed, and headed north on Lake Mary Road as the sun started its slide toward the western hills. The dispersed camping area at the north end of Upper Lake Mary sits about 20 minutes from town, accessible by a series of cinder spurs that branch off the main road like fingers reaching toward the water. I'd used a particular spot twice before, a level patch of ground scattered with juniper and mountain mahogany, bordered by a shallow wash that carries snowmelt toward the lake during spring runoff. We turned off Lake Mary Road, onto the familiar cinder track, tires crunching through loose volcanic rock that had been ground to powder by decades of traffic. The spur runs straight for about 100 yards before curving left toward a natural clearing that sits maybe 30 feet above the lake level. From there you can see the entire southern shore and the dark line of forest that rises toward Mormon Mountain. The lake stretched out flat and black, maybe 100 yards from where we'd park. The water level was low from the dry summer, exposing a wide band of red earth along the shoreline. A few scattered boulders that normally sit submerged broke the surface like the backs of sleeping animals. The whole scene held that peculiar stillness you get in high country just before weather moves through. We parked facing the tree line, leaving the truck bed pointed toward the water so we could sit on the tailgate and watch the lake while we ate. The tent went up 20 feet from the truck, positioned so the cab would block the worst of the wind that was already starting to pick up from the southwest. Tyler walked a wide circle around the campsite while I set up the tent, checking for the normal signs of previous use. We found day-old tire tracks in the cinders, rabbit prints near the wash, and a neat ring of fire-blackened rocks that someone had left behind. No trash, no broken glass, nothing that suggested the kind of party camping that sometimes turns these sites into wastelands. By sunset, we had hot dogs cooking over a small fire built inside the existing rock ring. The cold front was announcing itself the way mountain weather always does, with a subtle shift in air pressure that makes your ears pop and a sudden sharpening of distant sounds. I could hear individual vehicles on Highway 87, their tire noise carrying across what had to be 3 miles of forest. When a Stellar's jay moved through the juniper nearby, every branch scratch and wing beat reached us with unusual clarity. Neither of us talked much once the sun dropped behind the peaks. It was one of those evenings where conversation feels unnecessary, where the sound of your own voice seems too loud for the space around you. We ate our dinner and drank beer from the cooler while the temperature dropped steadily and the wind gained strength. By 10 o'clock, the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals that pulsed and dimmed with each gust of wind. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since sunset, and I could see my breath when I leaned close to the embers. We doused the coals with water from a gallon jug, stirring the ash until nothing remained but a faint whisper of steam. The cooler went next to the truck's rear passenger tire, positioned where we could reach it from inside the cab if we needed water during the night. Tyler laughed when I walked around the Tacoma twice, checking that all 4 doors were locked and testing each handle with a firm pull. Old habits from childhood camping trips with my father, who never trusted that the first button press on a key fob had actually engaged the locks. "You're worse than my mom," Tyler said, but I saw him check the driver's side handle anyway. We brushed our teeth using water from our bottles, spitting into the wash where the gray water would drain toward the lake. The wind carried away the mint smell of toothpaste almost immediately, replacing it with the clean scent of juniper and the faint mineral smell that rises from lake water when the air temperature drops faster than the water temperature. Inside the tent, we arranged our gear with the practiced efficiency of people who had shared small spaces many times before, boots positioned where we could find them in complete darkness. Headlamps hung around our necks on adjustable straps, cell phones within easy reach, though we both knew the signal was spotty this far from town. I zipped the tent fly shut at 11, cutting off our view of the outside world and reducing it to sounds and shadows. The wind worked the rain fly with steady pushes and pulls, creating the familiar rhythm of synthetic fabric under tension. Somewhere in the distance, a great horned owl called once and went silent. Tyler settled into his sleeping bag with the rustling movements of someone trying to find a comfortable position on uneven ground. I lay on my back, listening to the wind move through the trees and the faint lapping of small waves against the exposed shoreline. The combination of physical exhaustion from a full day's work and the clean mountain air was pulling me toward sleep when I heard my cousin speak from somewhere near the truck. The voice came from outside the tent, maybe 20 feet away, using Tyler's normal tone and cadence. Not a shout, not a whisper, just the conversational volume he used when he didn't want to wake anyone nearby. "Dave, bring the light." I rolled onto my left elbow, immediately confused. My first thought was that Tyler had somehow gotten out of the tent without me noticing, probably to urinate, and now needed the mag light for some reason. Then Tyler shifted beside me, his sleeping bag brushing against my arm as he turned over. I felt the movement clearly. He was right there, less than 2 feet away. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," Tyler whispered back, and I could hear the tension in his voice. We both held perfectly still, listening to the wind work through the guy lines and the rhythmic creaking of tent poles under stress. 30 seconds passed, maybe 40. Then I heard a single metallic click from the direction of the truck, the unmistakable sound of a door handle being tested against locked mechanism. The click was followed by weight shifting in the loose cinders, the particular grinding sound that volcanic gravel makes under pressure. If you've spent time camping on that substrate, you recognize the sound immediately. Something heavy placing footsteps carefully, trying to move quietly through material that broadcasts every movement. There was a pause, as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening for a response from inside the tent. Then, from across the lake, a lone coyote began its evening song. The cry started with the usual rising note that carries for miles in thin air, joined after a few seconds by a second voice from the same direction. But then something else picked up the pattern. Something much closer to our camp. It attempted to match the rhythm and tone of the distant coyotes but got the spacing wrong, producing a series of vocalizations that sounded like syllables arranged in the wrong order. The timing was off, the pitch inconsistent, as if something was trying to imitate a sound it had heard but didn't understand. I felt my scalp tighten and a cold knot form in my stomach. I've heard coyotes my entire life, lived with their songs since childhood. What was coming from the darkness near our camp was not a coyote. "Who's there?" I called out, loud enough to carry beyond the tent but not quite shouting. The false coyote sound stopped instantly, cut off mid-note with the abruptness of a radio being switched off. The silence that followed was complete except for the wind and the distant lapping of water against rock. Even the real coyotes across the lake had gone quiet. Then came footsteps in the cinders, moving away from the truck. They started slow and deliberate, each step placed carefully to minimize noise. But after 4 or 5 measured paces, the footfalls suddenly accelerated into a burst of movement that covered too much ground for the amount of sound it generated. Tyler and I stayed motionless in our sleeping bags for what felt like several minutes but was probably less than one. I could hear his breathing, controlled and shallow. My own heart was beating hard enough that I was sure the sound would carry outside the tent. "You good?" Tyler whispered. "Yeah? You? Let's look." We unzipped the tent fly together, moving the slider mechanisms as quietly as possible. I kept my headlamp around my neck but tilted it toward the ground and switched it to its lowest setting, producing just enough red light to avoid stepping on gear or tripping over guy lines. The mag light stayed in my left hand with my thumb resting on the power button, but I didn't activate it. The last coals in our fire ring were still giving off a faint orange glow, enough illumination to show the basic outline of our campsite and the dark bulk of the truck. What I saw next to the cooler made my stomach drop. Pressed into the powdery cinder next to the truck's rear tire was a barefoot print. Not a boot print, not a shoe print, but the clear impression of a naked human foot. The print was longer and narrower than mine by at least an inch, with toes splayed wide as if the foot had been pressed down hard to gain purchase in the loose material. But the proportions were wrong. The toes extended too far forward, creating an overall length that seemed excessive even for someone with large feet. There was no clear heel impression, just a faint suggestion of pressure behind the deeply embedded toe marks. The angle of the toes pointed southwest toward the thicker grove of juniper where our scent would be carried by the prevailing wind. Whatever had made this print had been moving upwind, positioning itself to catch our smell. Tyler emerged from the tent behind me, moving with the careful silence of someone who had spent years hunting elk in similar terrain. He saw the print immediately and stopped walking, his breathing becoming even more controlled. That's when something moved at the edge of our vision. It crossed through the periphery of the dim firelight, maintaining a distance of maybe 30 feet from where we stood. The movement suggested bipedal locomotion, but the proportions were wrong. The shoulders seemed too broad for the height. The gait was wrong for level ground, as if the legs were slightly too long for normal human stride. Most unsettling was its obvious effort to avoid giving us a clear view. It moved between obstacles, using the scattered juniper and granite boulders to break up its silhouette. We never got a direct look at its face or front profile, only glimpses of something that held a roughly human shape while moving in ways that no human should move. Tyler stepped behind the truck to urinate, keeping the vehicle between himself and the tree line where the movement had disappeared. I positioned myself where I could see his boots under the truck and maintain a view of our surroundings. The wind continued to carry our scent toward the lake, and whatever was out there seemed to be using that to its advantage, staying upwind to monitor us without revealing its own location. From the far side of the truck bed, close enough that it seemed to come from just beyond the tailgate, I heard my own voice speak Tyler's nickname. Ty, over here. The voice was perfect. Same pitch, same inflection, same slight rasp I get when I haven't had enough water. It was my voice in every detail except that my mouth had not moved and my throat had not made the sounds. Tyler finished quickly and backed around the truck bumper without turning away from the bed. "Dave," he said, and the way he spoke my name contained both a question and a warning. I was standing in full view 5 feet to his right. He could see me clearly in the dim light from the coals. He knew exactly where I was. "I'm right here," I managed to say, but the words came out thin and uncertain. We both understood what had just happened, even though neither of us wanted to acknowledge it directly. Something in the darkness had used my voice to try to draw Tyler away from the truck, away from the light, away from me. The realization hit both of us simultaneously. Whatever was out there had been listening to us long enough to learn the sound of our voices. It had been close enough to hear our conversations around the fire, our casual exchanges as we set up camp. It had been studying us. We began moving in small, careful steps back toward the truck doors, keeping our backs to the vehicle and our eyes on the tree line. I unlocked the doors with the key fob, timing the electronic beeps to coincide with wind gusts to avoid providing audio landmarks for whatever was tracking us. The world had contracted to a narrow focus, the rectangular windows of the truck cab, the strip of juniper beyond the firelight, the grinding sound of our own footsteps in the cinders. Every shadow held potential threat. Every movement of wind through branches could be masking the sound of something approaching. 30 feet from the truck, something moved between the juniper trunks again. It was maintaining the same careful distance, refusing to present a clear target for our lights or our attention. The shape held human proportions until we reached the truck and Tyler turned the key in the ignition. When Tyler hit the high beams, everything changed. The powerful headlights cut across the clearing like searchlight beams, illuminating an area roughly 60 feet wide and 40 feet deep. In that cone of brilliant white light, we saw something that made my throat close up and my hands begin to shake. A figure was standing between two juniper trees, maybe 30 feet from the truck. It held an approximately human silhouette, upright posture, 2 arms, 2 legs, head proportioned normally for the body size. But the moment the lights hit it, it dropped to all fours in a movement that violated every expectation of how a human body should bend. There was no visible articulation at the waist, no folding at the knees. The figure simply hinged forward at some point that seemed to be located somewhere around the middle of its torso, lowering itself to a quadrupedal position in one smooth, wrong motion. Then it disappeared behind a juniper tree that should not have been large enough to conceal something of its apparent size. We sat in the truck with the engine idling, high beams blazing across the tree line, waiting for any movement that would reveal where it had gone. The heater fan cycled on and off. The dashboard lights cast everything inside the cab in a green glow. Outside, the trees stood motionless in the artificial daylight of the headlamps. There had been no eye shine when the lights hit the figure, no reflective flash from retinas or glasses or any other surface. Just the flat certainty that something large had been standing upright in our camp and was now gone. The silence stretched for 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then we heard the cinders shift again, a quick scraping sound that suggested rapid movement followed by stillness. It had changed position, but we couldn't tell where. I felt the physical response that comes with genuine fear, hair standing up along my forearms, a metallic taste in my mouth, heightened awareness of every sound and movement. Not the theatrical fear of movies or campfire stories, but the primitive alarm system that evolution built into human nervous systems to keep us alive when predators were near. Tyler put the truck in reverse, and we began backing slowly up the cinder spur, headlights sweeping across trees and open ground. The beams washed over familiar landmarks. The fire ring we had built, the tent that now seemed impossibly small and vulnerable, the cooler sitting next to that impossible barefoot print. As we retreated, I felt it tracking our movement. Not alongside the truck, but ahead of us at an angle, the way a predatory animal will cut across terrain to anticipate where its prey is heading. We never saw it again, but I could sense its presence in the way the wind carried sounds, and in the feeling that we were being observed from multiple positions. The cinder road seemed longer, going out than it had coming in. Every curve held potential ambush. Every shadow between the trees could be concealing something that moved wrong, and spoke with stolen voices. We didn't speak until we reached the 24-hour gas station at Mormon Lake, pulling up under the harsh fluorescent lights of the canopy where everything was visible and normal and safe. The sudden transition from mountain darkness to commercial illumination made both of us blink and squint as our eyes readjusted. Tyler bought coffee from the machine, while I called the Coconino County Sheriff's non-emergency line. I didn't want sirens or emergency response. I wanted a written record and an official witness who could return to the site with us when daylight made investigation possible. The dispatcher took our names, location, and a brief description of what we had encountered. She was professional and efficient, asking practical questions about our exact location and whether we felt we were in immediate danger. When I described finding the footprint and hearing our own voices used to call us from the darkness, she paused for several seconds before asking me to repeat the details. "Someone will meet you at first light," she said. "Stay where there are other people until then." We sat in the truck under the station lights, drinking bad coffee and watching the glass doors as if they might open to admit something we had accidentally brought with us from the lake. The normal late-night traffic of long-haul truckers and shift workers felt surreal after what we had experienced. How could people be buying energy drinks and checking tire pressure when something impossible was moving through the forest just 20 minutes away? A Coconino County deputy arrived at the gas station as the sky began to lighten behind the mountains. He looked tired in the way people do when their shift spans the transition from night to day. But he listened to our account without skepticism or dismissal. He followed us back down Lake Mary Road in his SUV, emergency lights off, treating this as an investigation rather than a response to immediate threat. In the growing daylight, our campsite looked completely normal. The tent stood where we had left it, guy lines properly tensioned, stakes driven deep into the cinder. Our fire ring was neat and cold. There was no obvious disturbance, no scattered gear, nothing that would suggest any kind of struggle or confrontation. But the print remained. The deputy crouched next to the cooler and examined the impression in the powdery cinder with careful attention to detail. He took photographs from multiple angles with his phone, using a pen from his uniform pocket to provide scale reference. The toe marks were clearly defined, showing the kind of deep pressure that comes from significant weight being placed carefully. He followed the implied track toward the juniper grove, looking for additional prints or other signs of passage. What he found made him stand up and rub his jaw with the back of his hand. "This is odd," he said, which struck me as remarkable understatement. Where you would expect to find heel impressions from normal human walking, there was nothing. The deep toe prints continued for about 15 feet into the brush line, but they were not accompanied by the full footprints that would result from normal bipedal locomotion. It was as if something had been moving on the balls of its feet exclusively, never placing its heels against the ground. The deputy wrote an incident report number on a business card and handed it to me. He didn't try to explain what we had found. He didn't offer theories about hoaxers or wildlife or weather effects. He documented what was there and what wasn't, which was exactly what I needed from someone in authority. We broke camp with unusual efficiency, both of us wanting to finish the task and leave before whatever had visited us during the night decided to return. The morning sun was warming the air and burning off the frost that had formed on our gear, but I still felt exposed and watched whenever I turned my back to the tree line. Tyler rolled up the tent while I loaded the cooler into the truck bed, inside a black trash bag. I didn't want that cooler in my house after what had happened. The aluminum surface felt contaminated somehow, marked by proximity to something that had no business existing in the ordinary world. We checked the truck thoroughly for any additional prints or marks that might indicate tampering. The doors showed no scratches or dents around the handles. The windows were clean. The only unusual mark was a faint smear along the driver's side door that I couldn't identify or remember making. It might have been from my own hand during the previous evening's setup, but it bothered me enough that I photographed it before wiping it clean. The drive back to town took place in near silence, both of us processing what we had experienced and trying to fit it into our understanding of how the world works. Every few minutes, one of us would start to speak and then stop, as if the act of discussing it might somehow make it more real than we could handle. At the gas station where we had waited for dawn, an older man came in for coffee while we were settling up with the deputy. He glanced at our faces, noticed the official vehicle outside, and looked at the red dust on our boots that marked us as people who had been camping in the dispersed areas around the lakes. He didn't introduce himself or play the role of local expert. He didn't smile or treat our obvious distress as entertainment. Instead, he spoke quietly, while paying for his coffee. "Don't camp alone out there when the wind's right." I asked what he meant by right. He shrugged one shoulder. "When it carries names." He left without elaborating, climbing into a battered pickup and driving away toward Flagstaff. The deputy watched him go and made a note in his report, but he didn't comment on the exchange. That was October 2021. Tyler and I have not returned to Lake Mary for overnight camping since then. We've driven past the area during daylight hours and the familiar landmarks look exactly as they should. Peaceful, normal, suitable for family recreation and quiet weekends in the forest. But we've added rules to our camping routine that account for what we learned that night. We don't answer names called from the darkness. If someone needs to communicate with us after full dark, they can approach the campfire or the truck where we can see them clearly. We don't respond to voices that seem to come from the wrong direction or at the wrong time. We camp in larger groups now, never just the two of us in isolated locations. We choose sites with good sight lines and multiple escape routes. We carry more powerful lights and keep them within reach at all times. Most importantly, we don't sleep in areas where the wind patterns might carry our scent toward terrain we can't observe. Whatever was tracking us that night was using the air currents strategically, staying upwind to monitor our movements while remaining concealed. That suggests a level of intelligence and planning that makes me uncomfortable in ways I still can't fully articulate. People will explain this story in various ways. They'll talk about wind effects on sound transmission, about the way fear can distort perception and create false memories. They'll mention hoaxers and local kids playing pranks, wildlife behavior that seems unusual until you understand the underlying causes. I don't argue with those explanations because I can't prove they're wrong, but I know the sound of my own voice when I hear it. I know how a human body moves when it goes from vertical to horizontal posture. I know the difference between a coyote song and something else trying to imitate a coyote song. I also know the feeling of being studied by something that understands enough about human behavior to use our own voices against us. Something intelligent enough to stay upwind and patient enough to learn our patterns before making contact. Tyler brings up that night once a year or so, usually when we're planning camping trips or when someone asks why we don't go to Lake Mary anymore. He mentions it the way you might touch a healing wound to see if it still hurts. It does. I'm writing this down because the experience has remained vivid and unchanged in my memory for 3 years now. The details haven't softened or become uncertain the way most memories do. Every sound, every image, every moment of recognition and fear exists in my mind with the same clarity it had when it was happening. I'm also writing it because there are places in the Arizona high country where you should pay attention to small details. The way sound travels when weather systems move through. The shape a print makes when the weight distribution is wrong. The profile that refuses to show you its face. The voice that calls you from the wrong direction when you can see exactly where that voice should be coming from. These are things worth knowing if you spend time in remote areas where the old rules might still apply, where something patient enough and intelligent enough might be living according to patterns we don't understand. That was our last night at Lake Mary. I expect it will remain our last night there until one of us gets old enough to stop caring about new rules, or until whatever was out there moves on to different territory. The incident report number is still in my wallet. The cooler went to the landfill the next day. The memory stays sharp and complete, filed away like evidence for a case that will never come to trial. Some experiences don't require belief or explanation. They only require that you remember them accurately and adjust your behavior accordingly. This was one of those experiences. The wind still carries names sometimes. We just don't answer them anymore.